Good evening, shore defenders of dread, and welcome back to the Series 1 finale arc of Hitchcock's Tales That Terrify, Shadows from the Master on SL Tonight, escalating the Master's oceanic onslaught in John Wyndham's Out of the Deep. But first, time for a little sponsored love before the terror begins. Here's the spot.
Good morning, moms and dads. Start the day right with happy pills. You're all the breakfast that puts a smile on every face. Crunchy, delicious, film of joy. The whole family loves it. Happy pills, making mornings bright again. Wait, they're smiling too much. Honey, are you okay? The box says, one serving. Stop eating! They're too happy! Everything's spinning! Help. Wrong tape. Cut it. Happy pills! Happy pills. Mornings bright forever.
Wow, that cereal's got everyone way too happy. I'm starting to question our ad department. If you see me grinning uncontrollably later, send help. Anyway, back to business. Tonight on SL Tonight, Out of the Deeps. Turn off the lights and try not to smile too much. Building from Fireball's enigmas, we surge into Emergence from the Deeps. Phase 2 of the invasion. As fireballs settle in ocean trenches, bizarre sea tanks surface. Armored blobs with tentacles harvesting coastal life, dissolving ships and abducting people. Mike and Phyllis Watson chronicle the terror as panic spreads. Governments deny they then react. Wyndham's catastrophe ramps with ironic human hubris. Hitchcock's The Birds, 1963, mirrored such natural invasion, his fear of chaos fueling suspense. This phase honors that escalating unknown. Brace the shores, the story emerges. Phase 2. We made an early start the next morning. Car, ready loaded, had stood out all night and we were already a few minutes after 5. With the intention of putting as much of southern England behind us as we could before the roads got busy. It was 268.8, which wasn't .7 or .9 miles to the door of the cottage that Phyllis had bought with a small legacy from her Aunt Helen. I had rather favored the idea of a cottage a mere 50 miles or so away from London, but it was Phyllis's aunt who was to be commemorated with what was now Phyllis's money, so we became the proprietors of Rose Cottage, Penland, N.R., Constantine, Cornwall, telephone number Navescon 333. It was a grey stone, 5-roomed cottage set on southeasterly sloping, heatherly hillside, with its almost eaveless roof clamped down tight on it in true Cornish manner. Straight before us, we looked across the Helford River and on towards the Lizard, where by night we could see the flashing of the lighthouse. To the left was a view of the coast stretching raggedly away on the other side of the Falmouth Bay, and if we walked 100 yards ahead and so out to the lee of the hillside which protected us from the southwesterly gales, we could look across Mount Bay towards the Scilly Isles and the open Atlantic beyond. Falmouth 7 miles, Helston 9, elevation 332 feet above sea level. Several though not all, mod.con. Okay. We used it in a migratory fashion. When we had enough commissions and ideas on hand to keep us going for a time, We would withdraw there to drive our pens and bash our typewriters in pleasant, undistracted seclusion for a few weeks. Then we would return to London for a while, market our wares, cement relations, and angle for commissions until we felt the call to go down there again with another accumulated batch of work. Or we might perhaps simply declare a holiday. That morning I made pretty good time. It was still only 8:30 when I removed Phyllis's head from my shoulder and woke her up to announce, "Breakfast, darling." I left her trying to pull herself together to order breakfast intelligibly while I went to get some newspapers. By the time I returned, she was functioning better and had already started on cereal. I handed over her paper and looked at mine. The headline in both was given to a shipping disaster. That this should be so when the ship concerned was Japanese suggested there was little news from elsewhere. I glanced at the story below the picture of the ship. From a welter of human interest, I unearthed the fact that the Japanese liner, Yoma Shiro, bound from Nagasaki to Abona in the Moluccas, had sunk. Out of some 700 people on board, only 5 survivors had been found. Before I could settle down to the story, however, Phyllis interrupted with an exclamation. I looked across. Her paper carried no picture of the vessel. Instead, it printed a small sketch map of the area, and she was intently studying the spot marked X. "What is it?" I asked. Put her finger on the map. Speaking from memory, and always supposing that the cross was made by somebody with a conscience, she said, "Then that put the scene of the sinking pretty near our old friend the Medanos French." I looked at the map, trying to recall the configuration of the ocean floor around there. "It can't be far off," I agreed. I turned back to my own paper and read the account there more carefully. Women, apparently, screamed when women in night attire ran from their cabins. Women wide-eyed with terror clutched to children. Women this and women that when death struck silently at the sleeping liner. No one had swept all this woman jargon, and the London office's repertoire of phrases suitable for trouble at sea aside, the skeleton of a very bare agency message was revealed. So bare that for a moment I wondered why 2 large newspapers had decided to splash it instead of giving it just a couple of inches. Then I perceived the real mystery angle which lay submerged among all the phony dramatics. It was that the yacht Cercero had, without warning and for no reason, suddenly gone down like a stone. I got hold of a copy of this agency message later, and I found its darkness a great deal more alarming and dramatic than its business of dashing about in night attire. Nor had there been much time for that kind of thing, for after giving particulars of the time, place, etc., the message concluded laconically. Fair weather, no collision, no explosion, cause unknown. Foundered less 1 minute alarm. Owner's state impossible, unquote. So there can be very few streaks that night. Those unfortunate Japanese women and men had time to wake, and then perhaps a little time to wonder, refused to sleep, and then the water came to choke them. There were no shrieks, just a few bubbles as they sank down in their 19,000-ton steel coffin. When I read what there was, I looked up. Phyllis was regarding me, hand on hands, across the breakfast table. Neither of us spoke for a moment, and then she said, "It says here, in one of the deepest parts of the Pacific Ocean. Do you think this can be it, Mike, so soon?" I hesitated. It's difficult to tell. So much of this stuff's obviously synthetic. If it actually was only 1 minute. No, I suspend judgment, Phil. We'll see the Times tomorrow and find out what really happened, if anyone knows. We drove on, making poorer time on the busier roads, stopped to lunch at the usual little hotel on Dartmoor, and finally arrived in the late afternoon, 268.7 this time. We were sleepy and hungry again, and though I did remember when I telephoned to London to ask for cutting from sinking to be sent, the fate of the yacht Toshiro on the other side of the world seemed as remote from concerns of a small gray Cornish cottage as the loss of the Titanic. The Times noticed the affair the next day in a cautious manner, which gave an impression of the staff pursing their lips and staying their hands rather than mislead their readers in any way. Not so, however, the reports in the first batch of cuttings, which arrived on the afternoon of the following day. We put the stack between us and drew from it. Facts were evidently still meager, and comments curiously similar. All got a strong dose of not before the children this time, I said, as we finished. And not altogether surprising, seeing the hell of the advertisers we'd raise. Phyllis said coldly, Mike, this isn't a game, you know. After all, a big ship has gone down and 700 poor people have been drowned. That is a terrible thing. I dreamed last night that I was shut up in one of those little cabins when the water came bursting in. Yesterday, I began, and then stopped. It had been about to say that Phyllis had poured a kettle of boiling water down a crack in order to kill a lot more than 700 ants, but thought better of it. And yesterday, I admitted, a lot of people were killed in a road accident. A lot will be today. I don't see what that has to do with it, she said. She was right. It was not a very good amendment, but neither had it been the right moment to postulate the existence of a menace that might think no more of us than we of ants. As a race, I said, we have allowed ourselves to become accustomed to the idea that the proper way to die is in bed at a ripe age. It's a delusion. The normal end for all creatures comes suddenly, but that wasn't the right thing to say at that time either. We withdrew, using those short, brisk, hard-on-the-heels steps. I was sorry. I was worried too, but it takes me differently. Later I found her staring out of the living room window. From where she stood, at the side of it, she had the view of the blue water stretching to the horizon. Mike, she said, I'm sorry about this morning. This ship going down like that, suddenly got me. Until now, this has been a sort of guessing game, a puzzle. Losing the bathoscope with poor Wiseman and Trent was bad, so was losing the naval ships. But this, well, it suddenly seemed to put it in a different category. A big liner full of ordinary, harmless men, women, and children, peacefully asleep to be wiped out in a few seconds in the middle of the night. It's somehow a different class of thing altogether. Do you see what I mean? Naval people are always taking risks doing their jobs, but these people on the liner hadn't anything to do with it. It made me feel that those things down there had been working hypotheses that I had hardly believed in, and now, all at once, they had become horribly real. I don't like it, Mike. I suddenly started to feel afraid. I don't quite know why. I went over and put my arm around her. I know what you mean. I think it's part of it. The thing is not to let it get us down. She turned her head. Part of what? She asked, puzzled. Part of the process we're going through. The instinctive reaction. The idea of an alien intelligence here is intolerable to us. We must hate and fear it. We can't help it. Even our own kind of intelligence, when it goes a bit off the rails and drunken crazies, alarms us. Not very rationally. You mean I'd not be feeling quite the same way about it if I knew that it had been done by, well, the Chinese or somebody? Do you think you would? I'm not sure. Well, for myself, I'd say I'd be roaring with indignation. Knowing that it was somebody hitting well below the belt, I think I'd at least have a glimmering of who, how, and why to give me a focus. As it is, I've only the haziest impressions of the who, no idea about the how, and feeling about the why that makes me go cold inside, if you really want to know. She pressed her hand on mine. I'm glad to know that, Mike. I was feeling pretty lonely this morning. My protective coloration isn't intended to deceive you, my sweet. It's intended to deceive me. He thought. I must remember that, she said, with an air of extensive implication that I'm not sure I have fully understood yet. A pleasant month followed as we settled down to our task. Phyllis to the search for something which had not already been said about Beckford of Fonthill, though at first, did the less literary occupation of framing a series of royal love matches to be entitled provincially either The Heart of Kings or Cupid's Crown. The outer world intruded little. Phyllis finished the Beckford script and two more, and picked up the threads in the novel that never seemed to get finished. I went steadily ahead with the task of straining the royal love lives free from any political contaminations and writing an article or two in between to clear the air a bit. On days that we thought we were too good to be wasted, we went down to the coast and bathed or hired a sailing dinghy. The newspapers forgot about the Yotoshiro. The deep sea and all our speculations concerning it seemed very far away. Then, on Wednesday night, the 9 o'clock bulletin announced that Queen Anne had been lost at sea. The report was very brief, simply the fact followed by no details are available as yet, but it's clear that the list of the missing may prove to be very heavy indeed. There was silence for 15 seconds, and then the announcer's voice resumed. The Queen Anne, the current holder of the transatlantic record, was a vessel of 90,000 tons displacement. She was built. I leaned forward and turned it off. We sat looking at one another. Tears came into Phyllis's eyes. The tip of her tongue appeared, wetting her lips. "The Queen Anne! Oh, God!" she said. She searched for her handkerchief. "Oh, Mike, that lovely ship!" I crossed to sit beside her. For the moment, she was seeing simply the ship as we had last seen her, floating out from Southampton. A creation that had been somewhere between a work of art and a living thing, shining and beautiful in the sunlight, moving serenely out towards the high seas, leaving a flock of little tugs bobbing behind. But I knew enough of my wife to realize that in a few minutes she would be on board, dining in the fabulous restaurant, or dancing in the ballroom, or up on the decks watching it happen, feeling what they may have felt there. I put both my arms around her and held her close. I am thankful that such imagination as I, myself, have is more prosaic and seated further from the heart. Half an hour later, the telephone rang. I answered it and recognized the voices with some surprise. Oh, hello, Freddie. What is it?" I asked, for 9:30 in the evening was not a time that one expected to be called by the EBC's Director of Talks and Features. "Good. Afraid you might be out. You heard the news?" "Yes." "Well, we want something from you on this deep-sea miniseries, and we want it quick. Half-hour feature." Look here, the last thing I was told was to lay off any hint. This has altered all that. It's a must, Mike. You don't want to be too sensational, but you do want to be convincing. Make them really believe there's something down there. Look here, Freddie, if this is some kind of leg pull, it isn't. It's an urgent commission. That's all very well, but for over a year now I've been regarded as a dumb coot who can't let go of exploded crackpot theory. Now you suddenly ring me about the time when a fellow might have made a fool bet at a party and say, "Hell, I'm not at a party, I'm at the office, and likely to be here all night." "You better explain," I told him. "It's like this. There's a rumor running wild here that the Russians did it. Someone launched that one off within a few minutes of the news through on the tape. Why the hell anybody'd think they'd want to start anything that way, heaven knows, but you know how it is when people are emotionally worked up. They'll swallow anything for a bit. My own guess is that it's a let's have a showdown now school of thought seizing the opportunity, the damn fools. Anyway, it's got to be stopped. If it isn't, there might be enough pressure worked up to force the government out, or make it send an ultimatum or something. To stop this damn well, it's going to be, and the line is your deep sea minute. Tomorrow's papers are using it. The Admiralty is willing to play. We've got several big scientific names already. The BBC's next bulletin and ours will have good strong hints in order to start the ball rolling. The American networks have started already, and some of their evening editions are coming out on the streets with it. So if you want to put in your own pennyworth towards stopping the atomic bombs falling, get cracking right away." I hung up and turned to Phyllis. "Work for us, darling." The next morning, with one accord, we decided to go back to London. First thing we did upon reaching the flat was to switch on the radio. We were just in time to hear the sinking of the aircraft carrier Meritorious and the liner Carib Princess. Meritorious, it will be recalled, went down in mid-Atlantic, 800 miles southwest of the Cape Verde Islands. The Carib Princess, not more than 20 miles from Santiago de Cuba. Both sank in a matter of 2 or 3 minutes, and from each very few survived. It's difficult to say whether the British were the more shocked by the loss of a brand new naval unit, or by Americans by the loss of one of the best cruise liners the road was well convened. Both have already been somewhat stunned by the Queen Anne, for in the great Atlantic races there was a community of pride. Now, the language of resentment differed, but both showed the characteristics of a man who was once in the back of the crowd and is looking around, both fists clenched for someone to. The American reaction appeared more extreme, for, in spite of the violent nervousness of the Russians existing there, a great many found the idea of a deep-sea menace easier to accept than did the British, and a clamor for drastic, decisive action swelling up, giving a lead to a similar clamor at home. The Americans decided to make the placating gesture of depth bombing the Cayman Trench close to the point where the pair of princesses had vanished. They can scarcely have expected any decisive result from the random bombing of a beach some 50 miles wide as this. The occasion was well publicized on both sides of the Atlantic. American citizens were proud that their forces were taking the lead in reprisals. British citizens, though vocal in their dissatisfaction at being left standing at the post when the recent loss of two great ships should have given them a greater incentive to swift action, decided to applaud the occasion loudly as a gesture of reproof to their own leaders. A flotilla of 10 vessels commissioned for the task was reported as carrying a number of HE bombs, specially designed for great depth, as well as 2 atomic bombs. The put out from Chesapeake Bay emitted an acclamation which entirely drowned the voice of Cuba plaintively protesting at the prospect of atomic bombs on her doorstep. None of those who heard the broadcast put out from one of the vessels as the task force neared the chosen area will ever forget the sequel. The voice of the announcer, when it suddenly broke off from his description of the scene, to say sharply, "Something seems to be... My God, she's blown up!" And the boom of the explosion. The announcer gabbling incoherently, then a second boom. A clatter, a sound of confusion of voices, the clanging of bells, then the announcer's voice again, breath short, sounding unsteady, talking fast. "That explosion you heard, the first one, was the destroyer Cavort. She has simply disappeared. Second explosion was the frigate, Redwood. She has disappeared too. The Redwood was carrying one of our 2 atomic bombs. It's gone down with her. It was constructed to operate pressure at 5 miles depth. The other 8 ships of the flotilla are dispersing at full speed to get away from the danger area. We shall have a few minutes to get clear. I don't know how long. Nobody here can tell me. A few minutes, we think. Every ship in sight is using every ounce to get away from the area before the bomb goes off. The deck is shuddering under us. We're going full speed. Everyone's looking back at the place where the Redwood went down. Hey, doesn't anyone here know how long it'll take that thing to sink 5 miles? Hell, somebody must know. We're pulling away for all we're worth. All the other ships too. All getting the hell out of it, fast as we can make it. Anyone know what the area of the main spout's reckoned to be? For Christ's sakes, does anybody know any damn thing around here? We're pulling off now. Pulling off. Maybe we will make it. Wish I knew how long. Maybe faster now. Now faster. For heaven's sakes, pull the guts out of her. What's it matter? Hell, slog her to bits. Cram her along. 5 minutes now since the Redwood sank. How far she'll be down in 5 minutes? For God's sake, somebody, how long does that damn thing take to sink? Still going. Still keeping going. Still beating it for all we're worth. Thoroughly to heaven, we must be beyond the main spout area by now. Must have a chance now. We're keeping it up. Still going. Still going full speed. Everybody looking astern. Everybody watching and waiting for it. And we're still going. How can a thing be sinking all this time? But thank God it is. Over 7 minutes now. Nothing yet. Still going. And the ships, with great white wakes behind them. Still going. Maybe it's a dud. Or maybe the bottom is at 5 miles around here. Why can't anybody tell us how long it ought to take? It must be getting clear of the worst now. Some of the other ships are just black dots and the white spots now. Still going. We're still hammering away. Must have a chance now. I guess we really got a chance now. Everybody's still staring aft. Oh God! The whole season... And there it cut off. But he survived, that radio announcer. His ship and 5 others out of the flotilla of 10 came through, a bit radioactive, but otherwise unharmed. And I understand that the first thing that happened to him when he reported back to his office after treatment was a reprimand for the use of over-political language, which was given to offense to a number of listeners by its neglect to the third commandment. That was the day on which arguments stopped, and propaganda became unnecessary. 2 of the 4 ships lost in the Cayman Trench disaster had succumbed to the bomb, But the end of the other two had occurred in the glare of publicity that routed the skeptics and cautious alike. As last it was established beyond doubt there was something, and a highly dangerous something too, down there in the deeps. Such was the wave of alarmed conviction spreading swiftly round the world that even the Russians sufficiently overcame their national reticence to admit that they had lost one large freighter and one unspecified naval vessel, both again off the Kurils, and one more survey craft off eastern Kamchatka. In consequence of this, they were, they said, willing to cooperate with other powers in putting down this menace of the cause of world peace. The following day, the British government proposed that an international naval conference should meet in London to make a preliminary survey of the problem. A disposition among some of those invited to quibble about the locale was quenched by the unsympathetically urgent mood of the public. The conference assembled in Westminster within 3 days of the announcement, and as far as England was concerned, none too soon. In those 3 days, cancellations of sea passages had been wholesale. Overwhelmed, airline companies had been forced to apply priority schedules. The government had clamped down fast on the sales of oils of all kinds and was rushing out a rationing system for essential services. On the day before the conference opened, Phyllis and I met for lunch. "You ought to see Oxford Street," she said. "Talk about panic buying. Cottons particularly. Every hopeless line is selling out at double prices, and they're scratching each other's eyes out for things they wouldn't have been seen dead in last week." "From what they tell me of the city," I told her, "it's about as good there. Sounds as if you could get control of a shipping line for a few bob, but you couldn't buy a single share in anything to do with aircraft for a fortune. Steel's all over the place. And rubbers are too. Plastics are soaring. Distilleries are down. About the only thing that's holding its own seems to be breweries. I saw a man and a woman loading 2 sacks of coffee beans into a Rolls in Piccadilly, and there were—" He broke off suddenly, as though what I'd been saying had just registered. "You did get rid of Aunt Mary's shares in those Jamaican plantations?" she inquired, with the expression that she applies to the monthly housekeeping account. "Some time ago," I reassured her. "The proceeds went, oddly enough, into airplane engines and plastic." She gave an approving nod, rather as if the instructions had been hers. Then another thought occurred to her. "What about the press tickets for tomorrow?" she asked. "There aren't any yet for the conference proper," I told her. "There will be a statement afterward." She stared at me. "Aren't any? For heaven's sake, how do they expect us to do our job?" she exclaimed, and sat there brooding. When Phyllis said "our job," the words did not connote exactly what they would have implied a few days before. The job somehow changed quality under our feet. The task of persuading the public of the reality of the unseen, indescribable menace had turned suddenly into one of keeping up morale in the face of menace which everyone now accepted to the point of panic. ABC ran a feature called News Parade, in which we appeared to have assumed the roles of special oceanic correspondents without being quite sure how it occurred. In point of fact, Phyllis had never been on the EBC staff, and I had technically left it when I ceased, officially, to have an office there some 2 years before. Nobody, however, seemed to be aware of this except the accounts department, which now paid by the piece instead of by the month. All the same, there was not going to be much freshness of treatment in our assignment if we could get no nearer to the sources than our official handouts. Phyllis was still brooding about it when I left her to go back to the office I officially didn't have in EBC. We did our best during the next few days to play our part in putting across the idea of firm hands steady on the wheel, and the backroom boys who had produced radar, stick, and other marvels nodding confidentially and saying, in effect, "Sure, just give us a few days to think and we'll knock together something that will settle this lot." There was a satisfactory feeling that confidence was gradually being restored. Perhaps the main stabilizing factor, however, emerged from difference of opinion on one of the technical committees. General agreement had been reached that a torpedo-like weapon designed to give submerged escort to a vessel could profitably be developed to counter the assumed mine form of attack. The motion was accordingly put that all should pool information likely to help in the development of such a weapon. The Russian delegates demurred. Remote control of missiles, they pointed out, was, of course, a Russian invention in any case. Moreover, Russian scientists zealous in the fight for peace had already developed such control to a degree greatly in advance of that achieved by the capitalist-ridden science of the West. It could scarcely be expected of the Soviets that they should make a present of the discoveries to warmongers. The Western spokesman replied that while respecting the intensity of the fight for peace and the fervor with which it was being carried on in every department of Soviet science, except of course the biological, the West would remind the Soviets that this was a conference of peoples faced by a common danger and resolved to meet it by cooperation. The Russian leader responded frankly that he doubted whether, if the West had happened to possess a means of controlling a submerged missile by radio, such had been invented by Russian engineers, that they would care to share such knowledge with the Soviet people. The Western spokesman assured the Soviet representative that since the West had called the conference for the purpose of cooperation, it felt in duty bound to state that it had indeed perfected such a means of control as the Soviet delegate had mentioned. Following a hurried consultation, the Russian delegate announced that if he believed such a claim to be true, he would also know that it could only have come about through the theft of the work of Soviet scientists by capitalist hirelings. And since neither a lying claim nor the admission of successful espionage showed that disinterest and national advantage which the conference had professed, his delegation was left with no alternative but to withdraw. This action, with its reassuring ring and normality, exerted a valuable tranquilizing influence. Amid the widespread satisfaction and resuscitating confidence, the voice of Bacher, dissenting, rose almost alone. It was late, he proclaimed, but it still might not be too late to make some last attempt at a pacific approach to the sources of the disturbance. They had already been shown to possess a technology equal to, if not superior to, our own. In an alarming short time, they had been able not only to establish themselves, but to produce the means of taking effective action for their self-defense. In the face of such a beginning, one was justified in regarding their powers with respect, and for his part with apprehension. The very differences of environment that they required made it seem unlikely that human interests and those of xenobathic intelligences need seriously overlap. Before it should be altogether too late, the very great effort should be made to establish communication with them in order to promote a state of compromise which will allow both parties to live peacefully in their separate spheres. Very likely this was a sensible suggestion, though whether the attempt would ever have been produced to a desired result is different matter. Where there was no will whatever to compromise, however, the only evidence that his appeal had been noticed at all was that the word xenobathic and derived noun xenobath and its diminutive bathy began to be used in print. More honored in the dictionary than in the observance, remarked Bacher with some bitterness. If it is Greek words they are interested in, there are others, Cassandra, for instance. Hard on Bacher's words, but with a significance that was not immediately recognized, came the news first from Safira and then from April Island. Safira, a Brazilian island in the Atlantic, lies a little south of the equator, and some 400 miles southeast of the larger island of Fernando de Noronha. In that isolated spot, a population of 100 or so lived in primitive conditions, largely on its own produce, content to getting along on its own way, and little interested in the rest of the world. It is said that the original settlers were a small party who, arriving on account of a shipwreck sometime in the 18th century, remained perforce. But by the time they were discovered, they had settled to the island life and had already become interestingly inbred. In due course, and without knowing or caring much about it, they had ceased to be Portuguese and become technically Brazilian citizens, and a token connection with their foster mother country was maintained by a ship which called at roughly 6-month intervals to do a little barter. Normally, the visiting ship had only to sound its siren, and the Safirians would come hurrying out of their cottages down to the minute quay where their few fishing boats lay, to form a reception committee, which included almost the entire population. On this occasion, however, the hoot of the siren echoed emptily back and forth in the little bay, and set the seabirds wheeling in flocks, but no Safirian appeared at the cottage doors. The ship hooted again. The coast of Safira slopes steeply. The ship was able to approach within a cable's length of the shore, but there was nobody to be seen, nor, still more ominously, was there any trace of smoke from the cottage chimneys. A boat was lowered and a party, with the maid in charge, rowed ashore. They made fast to a ringbolt and climbed the stone steps up to the little quay. They stood there in a bunch, listening and wondering. There was not a sound to be heard but the cries of the seabirds and the lapping of the water. Must have made off, the lot of them. The boat's gone, said one of the sailors uneasily. Huh, said the mate. He took a deep breath and gave a mighty head, as though he had greater faith in his own lungs than in the ship's siren. They listened for an answer, but none came, said the sound of the mate's voice echoing faintly back across the bay. Huh, said the mate again. Better take a look. The uneasiness which came over the party kept them together. They followed him in a bunch as he strode towards the nearest of the small stone-built cottages. The door was standing half open. He pushed it back. Phew, he said. Several putrid fish decomposing on a dish accounted for the smell. Otherwise, the place was tidy and, by superior standards, reasonably clean. There were no signs of disorder or hastily packing up. In the inner rooms, the beds were made up, ready to be slept in. The occupant might have been gone only a few matter of hours, but for the fish and lack of warmth in the turf fire ashes. In the second and third cottages was the same air of unappreciated absence. In the fourth, they found a dead baby in its cradle in the inner room. The party returned to the ship, puzzled and subdued. The situation was reported by radio to Rio. Rio, in its reply, suggested a thorough search of the island. The crew started on the task with reluctance and a tendency to keep in close groups, but as nothing fearsome revealed itself, gradually gained confidence. On the second day of their 3-day search, they discovered a party of 4 women, with 6 children in 2 caves on a hillside. All had been dead for some weeks, apparently from starvation. By the end of the 3rd day, they were satisfied that if there were any living person left, he must be deliberately hiding. It was only then, on comparing notes, that they realized also that there could not be more than a dozen sheep and 2 or 3 dozen goats left out of the island's normal flocks of some hundreds. They buried the bodies they had found, radioed a full report to Rio, and then put to sea again, leaving Saphira with its few surviving animals to the sea birds. In due course, the news came through the agencies and one as an inch or 2 of space here or there, but no one at the time inquired further into the matter. The April Island affair was set in quite a different key and might have continued undiscovered for some time, but the coincidence of official interest in the place. The interest stemmed from the existence of a group of Javanese malcontents, variously described as smugglers, terrorists, communists, patriots, fanatics, gangsters, or merely rebels, who, whatever their true affiliations, operated upon a troublesome scale. For many years they dropped out of sight, but recently an informer had managed to reach the authorities with the news that they had taken over April Island. The authorities set out immediately to capture them. In order to minimize the risk to a number of innocent people who were being held hostage by the criminals, the approach to April Island was made at night. Under starlight, the gunboats stole quietly into a little-used bay, which was masked from the main village by a headland. There was a well-armed party accompanied by the informant who would act as their guide, was put ashore by the task of taking the village by surprise. The gunboat then drew off, moved a little way along the coast, and lay and lurked behind the point of the headland until the landing party should summon her to come in and dominate the situation. 3/4 of an hour had been the length of time estimated for the party's crossing the isthmus, and then perhaps another 10 or 15 minutes for its disposal of itself about the village. It was therefore with concern that after only 40 minutes had passed, the men aboard the gunboat heard the first burst of the automatic fire, succeeded presently by several more. With the element of surprise lost, the commander ordered full speed ahead, but even as the boat surged forward, the sound of firing was drowned by dull, reverberating boom. The crew of the gunboat looked at one another with raised eyebrows. The landing party had carried no higher forms of lethalness than automatic rifles and grenades. There was a pause, and then the hammering of the automatic rifle started. This time it continued longer in intermittent bursts until it was ended again by some boom. The gunboat rounded the headland. In the dim light, it was impossible to make out anything that was going on in the village 2 miles away. For the moment, all there was dark. Then a twinkling broke out, and another, at the sound of firing reaching them again. The gunboat continued at full speed, switched on her searchlight. The village and the trees behind it sprang into sudden miniature existence. No figures were visible among the houses. The only sign of activity was some froth and commotion in the water, a few yards out from the edge. Some claimed afterwards to see a dark, humped shape showing above the water a little to the right of it. As close inshore as she dared go, the gunboat put her engines astern and hove to it in a fury. The searchlight played back and forth over the huts and their surroundings. Everything lit by the beam had hard lines and seemed endowed with a curious glistening quality. The man on the oar-icons followed the beam, his fingers steady on the triggers. The light made a few more slow sweeps and then stopped. It was trained on several submachine guns lying on the sand closer to the water's edge. A stentorian voice from the hailer called the landing party from cover. Nothing stirred. The searchlight roved again, prying between the huts, among the trees. Nothing moved there. The patch of light slid back across the beach, steadied upon the abandoned arms. The silence seemed to deepen. The commander refused to allow landing until daylight. The gunboat dropped anchor. She rode there for the rest of the night, her searchlight making the village look like a stage set upon which any moment the actors might appear, but never did. When there was full daylight, the first officer, with a party of 5 armed men, rowed cautiously ashore under the cover from the ship's oar-icons. They landed close to the abandoned arms and picked them up to examine them. All the weapons were covered with a thin slime. Men put them in the boat and then washed their hands clean of the stuff. The beach was scored in 4 places by broad furrows leading from the water's edge towards the huts. They were something over 8 feet wide and curved in section. The depth in the middle was 5 or 6 inches. The sand in the edge was banked a trifle above the level of the surrounding beach. Some such track, the first officer thought, might have been left if a large boiler had been dragged across the foreshore. Examining them more closely, he decided from the lie of the sand that though one of the tracks led towards the water, the other 3 undoubtedly emerged from it. It was a discovery which caused him to look at the village with increased wariness. As he did so, he became aware that the scene which had glistened oddly in the searchlight was still glistening oddly. He regarded it curiously for some minutes, then he shrugged. He tucked the butt of his submachine gun comfortably under his right arm and slowly, with his eyes flicked right and left for the least trace of movement, led his party up the beach. The village was formed of a semicircle of huts of various sizes, impinging upon an open space, and as they drew closer, the reason for the glistening look became plain. The ground, the huts themselves, and the surrounding trees too, all had this thin coating of the slime which had been on the guns. The party kept slowly on until they reached the center of the open space. There they paused, bunched together, facing outward, examining each foot of cover closely. There was no sound, no movement, but a few fronds stirring gently in the morning breeze. The men began to breathe more evenly. The first officer removed his gaze from the huts and examined the ground. It was littered with a wide scatter of small metal fragments, most of them curved, all of them shiny with the slime. He turned one over curiously with the toe of his boot, but it told him nothing. He looked about them again and decided on the largest hut. "We'll search that," he said. The whole front of it glistened stickily. He pushed the unfastened door open with his foot and led the way inside. There was little disturbance, only a couple overturned stools suggesting a hurried exit. No one, alive or dead, remained in the place. They came out again. The first officer glanced at the next hut, then he paused and looked at it more closely. He went round to examine the side of the hut that they had already entered. The wall there was quite dry and clear of slime. He considered the surroundings again. "It looks," he said, "as if everything had been sprayed with this muck, something in the middle of the clearing." More detailed examination supported the idea, but took them further. "But how?" the officer asked meditatively. "Also, what? And why?" "Something came out of the sea," said one of his men, looking back uneasily towards the water. Some things. 3 of them, the officer corrected him. They returned to the middle of the open semicircle. It was clear that the place was deserted, and there did not seem to be much more to be learned there at present. Collect a few of these bits of metal. They may mean something to somebody, the officer instructed. He himself went across to one of the huts, found his empty bottle, scraped some slime into it, and corked it up. This stuff's beginning to stink now, the sun's getting at it, he said on his return. We might as well clear out. There's nothing we can do here. Back on board, he suggested a photographer to take pictures of the furrows on the beach and showed the commander's trophies now washed clean of the slime. Warrior stuff, he said, holding a piece of thick, dull metal. Shower of it around. He tapped it with a knuckle. Sounds like lead. Weighs like feathers. Cast by the look of it. Ever seen anything like that, sir? The commander shook his head. He observed that the world seemed to be full of strange alloys these days. Presently, the photographer came rowing back from the beach. The commander said, "We'll give him a few blasts of the siren. If nobody shows up, we'd better make a landing some other place and find a local inhabitant who can tell us what the hell goes on." A couple hours later, the gunboat cautiously nosed her way into a bay on the northeast coast of the April Island. A similar, though smaller, village stood there in a clearing close to the water's edge. The similarity was uncomfortably emphasized by an absence of life as well as by a beach displaying 4 broad furrows to the water's edge. Closer investigation, however, showed some differences. Of these furrows, 2 had been made by some objects ascending to the beach. The other 2 apparently the same objects descending. There were no traces of slime either in or about the deserted village. The commander frowned over his charts. He indicated another bay. "Alright, we'll try there then," he said. This time there were no furrows to be seen on the beach, though the village was just as thoroughly deserted. Again, the gunboat's siren gave a forlorn, unheeded wail. They examined the scene through glasses, then the first officer, scanning the neighborhood more widely, gave an exclamation. "There's a fellow up on that hill there. Wave a shirt or something." The commander turned his own glasses that way. 2 or 3 others a bit to the left of him, too. The gunboat gave a couple of hoots and moved closer inshore. The boat was lowered. "Stand off a bit till they come," the commander directed. "Find out whether there's been an epidemic of some kind before you try to make contact." He watched from his bridge. In due course, a party of natives, 8 or 9 strong, appeared from the trees, a couple 100 yards east of the village, and hailed the boat. They moved in their direction. Some shouting and counter-shouting between the 2 parties ensued, and then the boats went in and grounded on the beach. The first officer beckoned the natives with his arm, but they hung back in the fringes of the trees. Eventually he jumped ashore and walked across the strand to talk with them. An animated discussion took place. Cleared in an invitation to some of them to visit the gunboat was being declined with vigor. Presently, the first officer descended the beach alone, and the landing party headed back. "What's the trouble here?" the commander inquired as the boat came alongside. The first officer looked up. "They won't come, sir." "What's the matter with them?" "They're okay themselves, sir, but they say the sea isn't safe." "They can see it's safe enough for us. What do they mean?" "They say several of the shore villages have been attacked, and they think theirs may be at any moment." "Attacked? What by?" Perhaps if you come and talk to him yourself, sir." "I sent a boat so they could come to me. That ought to be good enough for them." "I'm afraid they'll not come short of force, sir." The commander frowned. "That scared, are they? What's been doing this attacking?" The first officer moistened his lips. The eyes avoided his commander's. They say whales, sir." The commander stared at him. "They say what?" he demanded. The first officer looked unhappy. "I know, sir, but that's what they keep on saying. Whales and giant jellyfish. I think that's, if you'd speak to him yourself, sir." The news about April Island did not exactly break in the accepted sense. Curious goings-on on an atoll which could not even be found in most atlases had, on the face of it, little news value, and the odd line or 2 which reported the matter was allowed to slip past. Possibly it would not have attracted attention, nor have been remembered until much later, if at all, but for the chance that an American journalist who had happened to be at Jakarta discovered the story for himself, took a speculative trip to April Island, and wrote the affair up for a weekly magazine. A pressman reading it recalled the Safira incident, linked the two, and splashed a new peril across the Sunday newspaper. It happened that this preceded by one day the most sensational communique yet issued by the Standing Committee for Action. The result of the deeps had the big headlines once more. Moreover, the term deeps was more comprehensive than formerly, for it was announced that the shipping losses in the last month had been so heavy that the areas in which they had occurred so much more extensive that, impending the development of more efficient means of defense, all vessels were strongly advised to avoid crossing deep water and keep as far as was practicable to the areas of the continental shelves. It was obvious that the committee would not have dealt such a blow to a confidence in shipping which had been recovering without the gravest reason. Nevertheless, the answers outburst indignation from the shipping interests, accusing of everything from sheer alarmism to a vested interest of airlines. To follow such an advice, they protested, would mean routing transatlantic liners into Iceland and Greenland waters, creeping coastwise down the Bay of Biscay and the West African coast, etc. Trans-Pacific commerce would become impossible, and Australia and New Zealand isolated. It showed a shocking and lamentable lack of sense of responsibility that the committee should be allowed to advise in this way, without full consultation of all interested parties. These panic-inspired measures which would, if heeded, bring the maritime commerce of the world virtually to a stop. Advice which could never be implemented could never have been given. The committee hedged slightly under the attack. It had not ordered, it said. It had simply suggested that wherever possible, vessels should attempt to avoid crossing any extensive stretch of water where the depth was greater than 2,000 fathoms, and thus avoiding exposing itself to danger unnecessarily. This, reported the ship owners curtly, was virtually putting the same thing in different words, and their case, though not their case, was upheld by the publication in almost every newspaper of sketch maps showing hurried and somewhat varied impressions of the 2,000 fathom line. Before the committee was able to re-express itself in still different words, the Italian liner Sabina and German liner Vorpommern disappeared on the same day, the one in mid-Atlantic, the other in South Pacific, and reply became superfluous. The news of the latest sinkings was announced on the 8 a.m. news bulletin on a Saturday. The Sunday papers took full advantage of their opportunity. At least 6 of them slashed at official incompetence with almost 18th century gusto and set the pitch for the dailies. On the Wednesday, I rang up Phyllis. I used to come upon her periodically when we had longer spell than usual in London, but she could not stand the works of civilization any longer without a break for refreshment. If it hadn't that I were free, I was allowed along too. If not, she went off to commune with nature of her own. As a rule, she returned spiritually refurbished in the course of a week or so. This time, however, the communion had already been going on for almost a fortnight, and there was still no sign of the postcard which customarily preceded her return by a short head. It did not come on the following day. The telephone down at Roach Cottage rang forlornly for some time. I was on the point of giving up when she answered it. "Hello, darling," she said, her voice. "I might have been the butcher or the income tax man," I reproved her. "They've given up more quickly. Sorry if I've been long answering. I was busy outside." "Digging into the garden?" I asked hopefully. "No, as a matter of fact, I was bricklaying." "This line's not good. It sounds like bricklaying." "It was, darling." "Oh," I said. "Bricklaying? It's very fascinating when you get into it. Did you know there are all kinds of bonds and things? Flemish bond and English bond and so on. You have things called headers and other things called... What is this, darling? A shed or something?" "No, just a wall, like Balbus and Mr. Churchill. I read somewhere that in moments of stress, Mr. Churchill used to find that it gave a tranquility, and I thought that anything could tranquilize Mr. Churchill was probably worth following up." "Well, I hope it has cured the stress." "Oh, it has. It's very soothing. I love the way when you put the brick down, the mortar squishes out at the sides, and you... Darling, the minutes are ticking up. I rang you to say that you're wanted here." "That's sweet of you, darling, but leaving a job It's not me. I mean, it is me, but not only... The EBC want a word with us." "What about?" "I don't really know. They're being cagey but insistent. Oh, when do they want to see it? Freddie suggested dinner on Friday. Can you manage that? There was a pause. Yes, I think I'll be able to finish. Alright, I'll be on that train that gets into Paddington about 6. Good, I'll meet it. There's another reason too, Phil. It being? The running sand, darling. The unturned coverlet. The tarnished thimble. The dull, unfavored drops from life's klepsydra. Mike, you've been rehearsing. What else had I to do? We were only 20 minutes late, but Freddie Whitler might have been desiccated for some hours from the urgency with which we were swept into the bar. He disappeared into the mob around the counter with controlled violence and presently emerged with a collection of double and single berries on a tray. Doubles first, he said. As soon as mine broadened out of the single track, he looked more himself and noticed things. He even noticed Phil's hands, their braided knuckles on the right, large piece of plaster on the left. He frowned and seemed about to speak, but thought better of it. I observed him covertly examining my face and then my hands. My wife, I explained, had been down in the country. The start of the bricklaying season, you know. He looked relieved rather than interested. Nothing wrong with the old team spirit, he inquired with a casual air. We shook our heads. Good, he said, because I got a job for you too. He went on to expound. Seeing that one of EBC's favorite sponsors had put a proposition to them. This sponsor had apparently been feeling for some time that a description, some photographs, and definite evidence of the nature of the Deeps creature was well overdue. Man of perception, I said, for the last 5 or 6 years. Shut up, Mike, said my dear wife briefly. Things, Freddie went on, have in his opinion now reached a pass where he might as well spend some of his money while it still has value, and might even bring in some valuable information. At the same time, he doesn't see why he shouldn't get some benefit out of the information if it's forthcoming. So he proposes to fit out and send out an expedition to find out what he can. And of course the whole thing will tie it up with exclusive rights and so on. By the way, this is highly confidential. We don't want the BBC to get onto it first. Look, Freddie, I said. For several years now, everybody's been trying to get on it, let alone the BBC. What the... Expedition where to? Asked Phyllis, practically. That, said Freddie, was naturally our first question, but he doesn't know. The whole decision on the location is in Bakker's hands. Bakker? I explained. Is he becoming untouchable or something? His stock has recovered quite a bit, Freddie admitted. And as this fellow, the sponsor, said, if you leave out all the outer space nonsense, the rest of Bakker's pronouncements have had a pretty high score. Higher than anyone else's anyway. So he went to Bakker and said, look here. These things come up on Saphira and April Island. Where do you think they're most likely to occur next, or at any rate soon? Bakker wouldn't tell him, of course, but they talked, and the upshot was that the sponsor will subsidize an expedition led by Bakker to a region to be selected by Bakker. What is more, Bakker also selects the personnel, and part of the selection with EBC's blessing and your approval could be you two. He was always my favorite orographer, said Phyllis. When did we start? Wait a minute, I put in. Once upon a time, an ocean voyage used to be recommended for health. Recently, however, so far from being healthy. Air, said Freddie. Exclusively air. People have doubtlessly got a lot of personal information about the thing the other way, but we'd prefer you to be in a position to bring it back. Phyllis wore and obstructed air at intervals during the evening. When we got home, I said, I'd rather you not take this up. Nonsense, of course we're going, she said, but do you think subsidized means like we get suitable clothes and things on expenses? I like idleness, in the sun, said Phyllis. From where we sat on an umbrellaed table in front of the mysteriously named Grand Hotel Britannia La Justicia, it was possible to direct idle contemplation on tranquility or activity. Tranquility was on the right. Intensely blue water glittering for miles until it was ruled off by a heart-straight horizontal line. The shore, running round like a bow, ended in a palm-tufted headland which trembled mirage-wise in the heat. Fat Coth, which must have looked just the same when it formed part of the Spanish Main. To the left was a display of life as conducted in the capital, and only town of the island of Escondida. The island name derived presumably from erratic seamanship in the past which had caused ships to arrive mistakenly, and one of the Caymans, but through all the vicissitudes of the parts it had managed to retain it, and much of the Spanishness too. The houses looked Spanish, temperament had a Spanish quality, in the language there was more Spanish than English, and from where we were sitting at the corner of the open space known indifferently as the plaza or the square, the church at the far end with the bright market stalls in front of it looked positively picture-book Spanish. The population, however, was somewhat less so, and ranged from sunburnt white to coal black. Only a bright red British mailbox prepared one for the surprise of learning that the place was called Smithtown, and even that took on a romance when one learned also that Smith commemorated had been a pirate in a prosperous way. Behind us, and therefore behind the hotel, one of the two mountains which made Escondida climbed steeply, emerging far above a naked peak with a scarf of greenery about its shoulders. Between the mountain's foot and the sea stretched a tapering rocky shelf, with the town clustered on its wider end. And there also had clustered for 5 weeks the Barker expedition. Barker had contrived a probability system all his own. Eventually his eliminations had given a list of 10 islands as likely to be attacked, and the fact that 4 of them were in the Caribbean area had settled our course. That was about as far as he cared to go simply on paper, and it landed us all at Kingston, Jamaica. There we stayed a week in company with Ted Jarvie, the cameraman, Leslie Bray, the recordist, and Muriel Flynn, one of the technical assistants, while Barker himself and his 2 male assistants flew about in an armed coastal patrol aircraft put at his disposal by the authorities and considered the rival attractions of Grand Cayman, Little Cayman, Cayman Brac, and Escondida. The reasoning which led to their final choice of Escondida was no doubt very nice, that it seemed a pity that 2 days after the aircraft had finished ferrying us on our journey to Smithtown, it should have been a large village on Grand Cayman which suffered the first visitation of the park. But if we were disappointed, we were also impressed. It was clear that Barker really had been doing something more than a high-class eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and had brought off a very near miss. The plane took 4 of us over there as soon as he had the news. Unfortunately, we learned little. The crew was on the beach, but they had been greatly tramped by the time we arrived. Out of 250 villagers, about a score had gotten away by fast running. The rest had simply vanished. The whole affair had taken place in darkness, that way no one had seen much. Each survivor felt an obligation to give an inquirer his money's worth, and the whole thing was almost forked over already. Barker announced that should we stay where we were, nothing would be gained by dashing hither and thither. We should be just as likely to miss the occasion as to find it. Even more likely, for Escondida, in addition to its other qualities, had the virtue of being a one-town island, so that way when an attack did come, and he was sure that sooner or later it would, Smithtown must almost certainly be the objective. We hoped he knew what he was doing, but in the next 2 weeks we doubted it. The radio brought reports of a dozen raids, all save one small affair in the Azores, were in the Pacific. We began to have a depressed feeling that we were in the wrong hemisphere. When I say we, I must admit I mean chiefly me. The others continued to analyze the reports and moved stolidly ahead with their preparation. One point was that there was no record of an assault taking place by day. Lights, therefore, would be necessary. Once the town council had been convinced that it would cost them nothing, we were all impressed into the business of fixing improvised floodlights on trees, posts, and corners of buildings all over Smithtown, though with greater proliferation towards the water side, all of which in the interest of Ted's cameras had to be wired back to the switchboard in his hotel room. The inhabitants assumed that a fiesta of some kind was in preparation. The council considered it a harmless form of lunacy, but were pleased to be paid for the extra current we consumed. Most of us were slowly growing more cynical, until the affair at Gallows Island, which, though Gallows was in the Bahamas, unnerved the whole Caribbean place. Port Anne, the chief town on Gallows, and 3 large coastal villages were raided the same night. About half the population of Port Anne and a much higher proportion from the villages disappeared entirely. Those who survived had either shut themselves in their houses or run away, but this time there were plenty of people who agreed that they'd seen things like tanks, like military tanks, they said, but larger, emerge from the water and come sliding up the beach. Owing to the darkness and confusion and the speed with which most of the informants had either made off or hidden themselves, there were only imaginative reports of what these sanctions had been done. The only verifiable fact was that from the 4 points of attack, more than 1,000 people in all had vanished during the night. All around there was a prompt change of heart. Every islander in every island shed his indifference and sense of insecurity, and was immediately convinced that his own home would be the next scene of assault. Ancient and uncertain weapons were dug out of cupboards and cleaned up. Patrols were organized, and for the first night or two of their existence, went on duty with the flying squadron. Talks on an inter-island flying defense system were proposed. When, however, the next week went by without a trace of further trouble anywhere in the area, enthusiasm. Indeed, for that week there was a pause in subsea activity all over. The only report as of a raid came from the Kurils from some Slavonic reason, undated, and therefore assumed to have spent some time under microscopic examination from every security angle. By the 10th day after the alarm, Escondida's natural spirit of Manana had fully reasserted itself. By night and siesta it slept soundly, the rest of the time it drowsed, and we with it. It was difficult to believe that we shouldn't go on like that for years, so we were settling down to it, some of us. Earl explored happily among the island flora. Johnny Talton, the pilot, who was constantly standing by, did most of it in the cafe where a charming senorita was teaching him the toys. Leslie had also gone native to the extent of acquiring a guitar which we could now hear tinkling through the open window above us. Phyllis and I occasionally told one another about the scripts we might write if we had the energy. Only Bacher and his two assistants, Bill Wyman and Alfred Haig, retained an air of purpose. If the sponsor could have seen us, he might well have felt dubious about his money's worth. I began to feel that I had had about enough of it. There was a suggestion of the Anglo-Saxon draining out and the tropical Latin seeping in, and while the sensation was not unpleasant, I felt it was a bit early in my life to let myself get fixed that way. This can't continue indefinitely, I said to Phyllis. I suggest we give Bacher a time limit, a week from now to produce this phenomena. Well, she began reluctantly. Yes, I suppose you're right. I'm damn sure I am, I told her. In fact, I'm not at all sure that even another week may not prove fatal. Which was, in an unintended way, truer than I knew. Darling, stop worrying that moon now and come to bed. No soul. That's the trouble. I often wonder why I married you. So I got up and joined her at the window. See, she said, the ship, an island, the sickle moon. So fragile, so eternal. Isn't it lovely? We gazed out across the empty plaza, past the sleeping houses, over the silvern sea. I want it. It's one of the things I'm putting away to remember, she said. Faintly from behind the opposite houses, down by the waterfront, came the tinkling of a guitar. El amor tanto vaya dulce, he sighed. And then suddenly the distant player dropped his guitar with a clang. Down by the waterfront, a voice called out, unintelligible but alarming. And then other voices. A woman screamed. We turned to look at the houses that hid the little harbor. Listen, said Philip. Mike, do you think? He broke off at the sound of a couple shots. It must be! Mike, they must be coming! There was an increasing hubbub in the distance. In the square itself, windows were opening, people calling questions from one to another. A man ran out of a door, round the corner, and disappeared down the short street that led to the water. There was more shouting now, more screaming, too. Among it, the crack of 3 or 4 more shots. I turned from the window and thumped on the wall which separated us from the next room. Hey, Ted, I shouted, turn up your lights, down by the waterfront, man. Lights! I heard his faint okay. He must have been out of bed already, for almost as I turned back to the window, the lights began to go on in batches. There was nothing unusual to be seen except a dozen or more men helping across the square toward the apartment. Quite abruptly, the noise which had been rising in crescendo was cut off. Ted's door slammed. His boots thudded along the corridor past our room. Beyond the houses, this yelling and screaming broke out again, louder than before, as if it had gained force from being briefly dammed. I began, and then stopped when I found that Phyllis was no longer beside me. I looked across the room and saw her in the act of locking the door. I went over. I must go down there. I must see what's... No! She said. She turned and planted her back firmly against the door. She looked rather than a severe angel barring a road, except that angels are assumed to wear respectable cotton night dresses, not nylon. But Phil, it's the job. It's what we're here for. I don't care. We wait a bit. He stood without moving, severe angel expression now modified by that of a mutinous small girl. I held out my hand. Phil, please give me that key. No, she said, and flung it across the room to the window. It clattered on the cobbles outside. I gazed after it in astonishment. That was not at all the kind of thing one associated with Philip. All over now floodlit square, people were now hurriedly converging towards the street on the opposite side. I turned back. Phil, please get away from that door. She shook her head. Don't be a fool, Mike. You've got a job to do. That's just what I... No, it isn't. Don't you see? The only reports we've had at all were people who didn't rush to find out what was happening. The ones who either hid or ran away. I was angry with her, but not too angry for the sense of that to reach me and make me pause. He followed up. It's what Freddie said. The point of our coming at all is what we should be able to go back and tell them about it. That's all very well, but no, look there. She nodded toward the window. People were still converging upon the street that led to the waterside, but they were no longer going into it. A solid crowd was piling up at the entrance. Then, while I still looked, the previous scene started to go in reverse. The crowd backed and began to break up at its edges. More men and women came out of the street, thrusting it back until it was dispersing all over the square. I went closer to the window to watch. Phyllis left the door and came and stood beside me. Presently, we spotted Ted, turret lens, movie camera in hand, hurrying back. What is it? I called down. God knows, can't get through. There's a panic up the street there. They all say it's coming this way, whatever it is. If it does, I'll get a shot from my window. Can't work this thing in the mob. I glanced back and then disappeared in the hotel doorway below us. People were still pouring into the square and breaking into a run when they reached a point where there was room to run. There had been no further sound of shooting, but from time to time there would be another outbreak of shouts and screams somewhere at the hidden far end of the short street. Among those headed back to the hotel came Dr. Bacher himself, and the pilot, Johnny Tolton. Bacher stopped below and shouted up. Heads popped out of various windows. He looked them over. Where's Alfred? He asked. No one seemed to know. If anyone sees him, call in inside, Bacher instructed. The rest of you stay where you are. Observe what you can, but don't expose yourselves till we know more about it. Ted, keep all your lights on. Leslie, just on my way with my portable recorder, Doc, said Leslie's voice. No, you're not. Sling the mic outside the window if you like, and keep yourself under cover. And that goes for everyone for the present. But Doc, what is it? We don't know, so we keep it silent until we find out why it makes people scream. Where the hell is Miss Flynn? Oh, you're there. Right. Keep watching, Miss Flynn. He turned to Johnny and exchanged a few inaudible words with him. Johnny nodded and made off around the back of the hotel. Bacher himself looked across the square again and then came in, shutting the door behind him. Running, or at least hurrying, figures were still scattering across the square in all directions, but no more were emerging from the street. Those who had reached the far side turned back to look, hovering close to doorways or alleys into which they could jump swiftly if necessary. Half a dozen men with guns or rifles laid themselves down on the cobbles, their weapons all aimed at the mouth of the street. Everything was much quieter now, except for a few sounds of sobbing. The tense, expectant silence held the whole scene. And then in the background, one became aware of a grinding, scraping noise, not loud, but continuous. The door of a small house close to the church opened. A priest, in a long black robe, stepped out. A number of people nearby ran toward him and then knelt around him. He stretched out both arms as though to encompass and guard them all. The noise from the narrow street sounded like heavy dragging of metal upon stone. 3 or 4 rifles fired suddenly, almost together. Our angle of view still stopped us from seeing what they fired at, but they let go a number of rounds each. Then the men jumped to their feet and ran further back, almost to the further side of the square. There they turned around and reloaded. From the street came a noise of cracking timbers and falling bricks and glass. Then we had our first sight of a sea tank, a curve of dull gray metal sliding into the square, carrying away the lower corner of the house front as it came. Shots cracked at it from half a dozen different directions. Bullets splattered or thudded against it without effect. Slowly, heavily, with an air of inexorability, it came on, grinding and scraping across the cobbles. It was inclining slightly to its right, away from us, and towards the church, carrying away more of the corner house, unaffected by the plaster, bricks, and beams that fell on it and slithered down its side. More shots smacked against it or ricocheted away, whining, but it kept steadily on, thrusting itself into the square at something under 3 miles an hour, massively indeflectible. Soon we were able to see the whole of it, imagining an elongated egg which had been halved down its length and set flat side to the ground, with the pointed end foremost. Consider this egg to be 30 and 35 feet long, of a drab, lusterless leaden color, and you will have a fair picture of this sea tank as we saw it pushing into the square. There was no way of seeing how it was propelled. There may have been rollers underneath, but it seemed and sounded simply to grate forward on its metal belly with plenty of noise, but none of machinery. It did not jerk to turn as a tank does, and neither did it steer like a car. It simply moved to the right on a diagonal, still pointing forward. Close behind it followed another, exactly similar contrivance which slanted its way to the left, in our direction, directing the house front on the nearest corner of the street as it came. The third kept straight ahead in the middle of the square, and then stopped. At the far end, the crowd that had knelt about the priest scrambled to its feet and fled. The priest himself stood his ground. He barred the thing's way. His right hand held a cross extended against it, his left was raised, fingers spread and palm outward to halt it. The thing moved, neither faster nor slower, as if he had not been there. The curved flank pushed him aside a little as it came, then it, too, stopped. A few seconds later, the one at our end of the square reached what was apparently its appointed position, and also stopped. Groups will establish themselves at first objective in extended order, I said to Phyllis, as regarded the three evenly spaced out in the square. This isn't haphazard. Now what? For almost half a minute, it did not appear to be now anything. There was a little more sporadic shooting, some of it from windows which all around the square were full of people hanging out to see what went on. None of it had any effect on the targets, and there was some danger from ricochet. Look, said Phyllis suddenly, this one's bulging. She was pointing at the nearest. The previous smooth fore and aft sweep of its top was now disfigured at the highest point by a small dome-like excretion. It was lighter colored than the metal beneath, all kind of off-white, semi-opaque substance which glittered viciously under the flood. It grew as one watched it. They're all doing it, she added. It was a single shot. The assurance quivered, but went on swelling. It was growing faster now. It was no longer dome-shaped, but spherical, attached to the metal by a neck, inflating like a balloon and swaying slightly as it descended. It's gonna pop, I'm sure it is, Phyllis said apprehensively. There's another coming up further down its back, I said. 2 more, look. The first Emergence did not pop. It was already some 2'6" in diameter and still swelling fast. It must pop soon, she muttered, but still it did not. It kept on expanding until it must have been all of 5 feet in diameter. It stopped growing. It looked like a huge, repulsive bladder. A tremor and a shake passed through it. It shuddered jelly-wise, became detached, and wobbled in the air with the uncertainty of an overblown bubble. In a lurching, amoebic way, it ascended for 10 feet or so, then it vacillated, steadying into a more stable sphere. And suddenly, something happened to it. It did not explode, nor was there any sound. Rather, it seemed to slit open, as if it had been burst into an instantaneous bloom by a vast number of white cilia, which rayed out in all directions. The instinctive reaction was to jump back from the window away from it. We did. 4 or 5 of the cilia, like long white whiplashes, flicked in through the window and dropped to the floor. Almost as they touched it, they began to contract and withdraw. Phyllis gave a sharp cry. I looked round at her. Not all of the long cilia had fallen on the floor. One of them flipped the last 6 inches of the planks onto her right forearm. It was already contracting, pulling her arm towards the window. She pulled back. With her other hand, she tried to pick the thing off, but her fingers stuck to it as soon as they touched it. Mike! She cried. Mike! The thing was tugging hard, looking tight as a bowstring. She had already been dragged a couple steps towards the window before I could get after her in a kind of diving tackle. The force of my jump carried her across the other side of the room. It did not break the thing's hold, but it did move her over so it no longer had a direct pull through the window and was forced to drag round a sharp corner. And drag it did. Lying on the floor now, I got crook of my knee round a bed leg for better purchase, and hung on for all it was worth. If I moved Phyllis, then I would have to drag me and the bedstead too. For a moment I thought it might. Then Phyllis screamed, and suddenly there was no more tension. I rolled her to one side, out of line of anything else that might come through the window. She was in a faint. A patch of skin, 6 inches long, had been torn clean away from her right forearm, and more had gone from her fingers on her left hand. The exposed flesh was just beginning to bleed. Outside in the square there was a pandemonium of shouting and screaming. I risked putting my head round the side of the window. The thing that had burst was no longer in the air. It was now a round body, no more than a couple of feet in diameter, surrounded by a radiation of silicon. It was drawing these back into itself with whatever they had caught, and the tension was keeping it a little off the ground. Some of the people it was pulling in were shouting and struggling. Others were like inert bundles of clothes. I saw poor Meryl Flynn among them. She was lying on her back, dragged across the cobbles by a tentacle caught in her red hair. She had been badly hurt by the fall when she was pulled out of her window and was crying out with terror too. Leslie dragged almost alongside her, but it looked as if the fall had mercifully broken his neck. Over on the far side, I saw a man rush forward and try to pull a screaming woman away, but when he touched the sill and held her, his hand became fastened to it too, and they were dragged along together. As I watched, I thanked God I had grabbed Phyllis's arm and not the sill itself in trying to free her. As the circle contracted, the white silhouette came closer to one another. Several people inevitably touched more of them and became more hopelessly enmeshed than before. They struggled like flies on flypaper. There was a relentless deliberation about it which made it seem horribly as though one watched through the eye of a slow-motion camera. Then I noticed that another of the misshapen bubbles had wobbled into the air and drew back hurriedly before it should burst. Three more Scylla whipped in through the window, lay for a moment like white cords on the floor, and then began to draw back. When they had vanished across the sill, I leaned over to look out of the window again. In several places about the square there were converging knots of people struggling helplessly. The first and nearest had contracted until its victims were bound together into a tight ball, out of which a few arms and legs still flailed wildly. Then, as I watched, the whole compact mass tilted over and began to roll away across the square towards the street by which the sea tanks had come. The machines, or whatever the things were, still lay where they had stopped, looking like huge gray slugs, each engaged in producing several as disgusting bubbles at different stages. I dodged back as another was cast off, but this time nothing happened to find our window. I risked leaning out for a moment to pull the cast windows shut and got them closed just in time. 3 or 4 more lashes smacked against the glass with such force that one of the panes was cracked. Then I was able to attend to Phyllis. I lifted her on the bed and tore a strip of the sheet to bind up her arm. Outside, the screaming and shouting and uproar was still going on, and among it the sound of a few shots. When I had bandaged the arm, I looked out again. Half a dozen objects, looking now like tight round bales, were rolling over and over on their way to the street that led to the waterfront. I turned back again and tore another strip off the sheet to put round Phyllis's left hand. While I was doing it, I heard a different sound above the hubbub outside. I dropped the cotton strip and ran back to the window in time to get a glimpse of the plane coming in low. The cannon in the wings started to twinkle, and I threw myself back out of harm's way. There was a dull whoosh of an explosion. Simultaneously, the windows blew in, the light went out, bits of something whizzed past, and something else splattered all over the room. I picked myself up. The outdoor lights down on our end of the square had gone out too, so that it was difficult to make out much there. But up on the other end, I could see that one of the sea tanks had begun to move. It was sliding back by the way it had come. Then I heard the sound of the aircraft returning and went down on the floor again. There was another whoosh, but this time we did not catch the force of it, though there was a clatter of things falling outside. "Mike," said a voice from the bed, a frightened voice. "It's all right, darling, I'm here," I told her. The moon was still bright, and I was able to see better now. "What happened?" she asked. "They've gone. Johnny got 'em with the plane. At least, I suppose it was Johnny," I said. "It's all right now. Mike, my arms do hurt. I'll get a doctor as soon as I can, darling." "What was it? It had got me, Mike. If you hadn't held on. It's all over now, darling." She broke off at the sound of the plane coming back once more. We listened. The cannon was firing again, but this time there was no explosion. "Mike, there's something sticky. Is it blood? You're not hurt." "No, darling, I don't know what it is. It's all over everything." "It's shaking, Mike." "Sorry, I can't help it. Oh, Phil, darling Phil, so nearly, if you'd have seen them, Muriel and the rest, it might have been—" There, she said, as if I were aged about 6. "Don't cry, Mickey. It's over now." She continued. "Oh, Mike, my arm does hurt." "Lie still, darling. I'll get the doctor," I told her. I went for the locked door over the chair and relieved my feelings on it quite a lot. It was the subdued remnant of the expedition that foregathered the following morning. Walker, Ted Jarvie, and ourselves, Johnny had taken off earlier with the film and recording, including an eyewitness account I had added later, and was on his way to Kingston. Phyllis's right arm and left hand were swathed in bandages. He looked pale, but had resisted all persuasions to stay in bed. Walker's eyes had entirely lost their customary twinkle. Where every lock of gray hair hung forward over a face which looked more like wine and older than they'd had on the previous evening. He limped a little and put some of his weight on the stick. Ted and I were unscathed. He looked questioningly at Walker. "If you can manage it, sir," he said, "I think our first move ought to be to get out of this thing." "By all means," Walker agreed. "A few twinges are nothing compared with this. The sooner the better," he added, got up to lead the way to Windbury. The cobbles of the square, the litter of metal fragments that lay about it, the houses all around, the church, everything in sight glistened with a coating of slime. And there was more of it that one did not see, splashing in almost every room that fronted on the square. The previous night it had been a simply strong, fishy, salty smell, but with the warmth of the sun at work upon it had begun to give off an odor that was already fetid and rapidly becoming miasmic. Even 100 yards made a great deal of difference. Another 100 and we were clear of it, among the palms which fringed the beach on the opposite side of town from the harbor. Seldom had I known the freshness of a light breeze to smell so good. Walker sat down and leaned his back against a tree. The rest of us disposed ourselves and waited for him to speak first. For a long time he did not. He sat motionless, looking blindly out to sea. Then he sighed. "Alfred," he said, "Bill, Muriel, Leslie, I brought you all here. I've shown very little imagination and consideration for your safety, I'm afraid." Phyllis leaned forward. "You mustn't think like that, Dr. Brucker. None of us had to come, you know. You offered us the chance to come, and we took it. If the same thing had happened to me, I don't think Michael would have felt that you were to blame, and would you, Mike?" "No," I said. I knew perfectly well whom I should have blamed, forever and without reprieve. "And I shouldn't, and I'm sure the others would feel the same way," she added, putting her uninjured right hand on his sleeve. He looked down at it, blinking a little. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and laid his hands on hers. His gaze strayed beyond her wrist to the bandages above. "You're very good to me, my dear," he said. He patted the hand and then sat straight, pulling himself together. Presently, in a different tone, "We have some results. Not perhaps as conclusive as we had hoped, but some tangible evidence at least. Thanks to Ted, the people at home will now be able to see what we're up against, and thanks to him, too, we have the first specimen." "Specimen?" repeated Phyllis. "What of?" "Bit of one of those tentacle things," Ted told her. "How on earth?" "Luck, really. You see, when the first one burst, nothing came in at my particular window. But I could see what was happening in other places, so I opened my knife and put it handily on the sill, just in case. One did come in with the next shower. It fell across my shoulder, and I caught up the knife and slashed it just as it began to pull. There was about 18 inches of it left behind. It just dropped off on the floor, wriggled a couple times, and then curled up. We posted it off to Johnny." "Ugh," said Phyllis. "In the future," I said, "we too will carry knives." "Make sure they're sharp. It's mighty tough stuff," Ted advised. "If you can find another bit of one, I'd like to have it for examination," said Doctor. "We decided that one had better go off to the experts. There's something very peculiar indeed about those things. The fundamental is obvious enough. It goes back to some type of sea phenomenon. But whether the things have been bred, or whether they have been in some way built up on a basic pattern," shrugged without finishing the question. "I find several points extremely disturbing. For instance, how are they made to clutch the animate even when it's clothed, and not attach themselves to the inanimate? Also, how is it possible they can be directed on the route back to the water, instead of simply trying to reach it the nearest way?" The first of those questions is more significant. It implies specialized purpose. Things are huge, you see, but not like weapons in the ordinary sense. Not just to destroy, that is, but more like snares. I sat thinking that over for a bit. "But why?" said Phyllis. Walker frowned. "Why?" he repeated. "Everybody's always asking why. Why did the things come to the deeps? Why didn't they stay at home? Why did they now come out of the deeps onto the land? And now, why do they attack us this way and not that? How can we possibly hope to know the answers until we can find out more about the sort of creatures they are? The human view would suggest one or two motives, but that isn't to say they don't have entirely different motives of their own." "Two motives?" said Phyllis meekly. "Yes, they may be trying to exterminate us. For all we can tell, they may be under the impression we have to live on coastlines, and that they can gradually wipe us out this way. You see, it is so difficult, we don't know how much they know about us either. But I shouldn't think that that is the purpose. It doesn't account for the tactics of rolling the victims back to the water. At least, not fully. The Colindrons could easily crush them and lead them, so it looks as though the other motive might fit. Simply they might find us and perhaps other land creatures, if you recall the disappearance of goats and sheep on Saphira, good to eat, or even both. Plenty of tribes have been an old established custom of eating their enemies. You mean they may have some sort of, sort of shrimping for us? Phyllis asked uneasily. Well, we land creatures let down trawls into the sea and eat what they catch there. Why not a reverse process for intelligent sea creatures? But of course, there again I am giving a human outlook. That's what we will all keep trying to do with our lives. The trouble is we all of us read too many stories where the invaders turn up behaving and thinking just like human beings. Whatever their shape happens to be, and we can't shake loose from the idea their behavior must be comprehensible to us. In fact, there's no reason why it should be, and plenty of reasons why it shouldn't. Shrimping, repeated Phyllis thoughtfully. How disgusting. But it could be. Walker said firmly. We will now drop this why. We may or may not learn more about it later. The important thing now is how. How to stop the things and how to attack them. He paused. I must confess that I went on thinking about the why, and feeling that even if the purport were right, Phyllis might have chosen some pleasanter or more dignified analogy than shrimping. Presently, Barker went on. Ordinary rifle fire doesn't appear to trouble either the sea tanks or their Millibrock things unless they are vulnerable spots that were not found. Explosive candy shells can, however, fracture the covering. The manner in which it then disintegrates suggests that it's already under very strong stress and not very far from breaking point. We may deduce that from that in the April Island affair there either a lucky shot or a grenade was used. When we used last night, certainly explains the natives' talk of whales and jellyfish. These sea tanks might easily, at a distance, be taken for whales. And regarding the jellyfish, they weren't so far out. The things must almost without doubt be closely related to the colodendраtes. As to the sea tanks, the contents seem to have simply gelatinous masses confined under immense pressure. But it is hard to credit that this can be really so. Apart from any other consideration, it would seem that there must be a mechanism of some kind to propel those immensely heavy hulls. I went to look at their trails this morning. Some of the cobblestones had been ground down and some cracked into flakes by the weight, but I couldn't find any track marks or anything to show that these things dragged themselves along by grabs as I thought might be the case. I think we are stumped there for the present. Intelligence of a kind there undoubtedly is, though it appears not to be very high or else not very well coordinated. All the same, it was good enough to lead them from the waterfront to the square, which was the best place for them to operate. I've seen army tanks carry away house corners in much the same way as they did, I observed. That's one possible indication of poor coordination, Walker replied, somewhat crushingly. Now we have observations to add to those I have made. He looked around inquiringly. Anything else? Did anyone notice whether the shots appeared to have any effect at all on those tentacular forms? As far as I could see, either the shooting was lousy or the bullets went through without bothering, told Tugman. Said Barker, and lapsed into reflection for a while. Presently I became aware of Phyllis muttering. What? He inquired. I was just saying Millibrochiate tentacular colosyndrates, she explained. Oh, said. Nobody made any further comment. Four of us continued to sit on, looking out across a blandly innocent azure sea. Among the other papers I bought at London Airport was a current number of the Beholder, though it is, I am aware, not without its merits and even well thought of in some circles. It leaves me with an abiding sense that it's more given to expressing its first prejudices than its second thoughts. Perhaps if we were to go to press a day later, however, this discovery in this issue of leader entitled Dr. Barker Rides Again did nothing to alter my impression. The text ran something after this fashion. Neither the courage of Dr. Alistair Barker is going forth to meet his submarine dragon, nor his propensity in correctly deducing where the monster might be met, can be questioned. The gruesome and fantastically repulsive scenes to which the EBC treated us in our homes last Tuesday evening make it more to be wondered at that any of the parties should have survived than that of the four members should have lost their lives. Dr. Barker himself is to be congratulated on his escape at the cost of nearly a sprained ankle when his sock and shoe were wrenched off, and a member of the party on an even narrower escape. Nevertheless, horrible though this affair was, and valuable as some of the doctor's observations may prove in suggesting countermeasures, it would be a mistake for him to assume that he has now granted an unlimited license to adopt his former role as a world premier scaremonger. It is our inclination to attribute his suggestion that we should proceed forthwith and embattle virtually the entire western coastline of the United Kingdom, the effect of recent unnerving experiences, upon a temperament which has never shunned the sensational, rather than to the conclusion of mature consideration. Let us consider the cause of this panic-stricken recommendation. It is this. A number of small islands, all but one of them lying within the tropics, have been raided by some marine agency of which we, as yet, know little. In the course of these raids, some hundreds of people, to an estimate total no larger than that of the number of persons injured on the roads in a few days, have lost their lives. This is unfortunate and regrettable, but scarcely grounds for the suggestion that we, thousands of miles from the nearest incident of the kind, should, at the taxpayer's expense, proceed to beset our whole shoreline with weapons and guards. This is the line of argument which should have erected shock-proof buildings in London on account of an earthquake in Tokyo. And so on. There wasn't a lot left of poor Barker by the time they had finished with him. I did not show it to him. We would find out soon enough, for the Beholder's readerships had no use for the unique approach. They liked the popular view, custom tailored. Presently, the helicopter set us down at the terminus, and Phyllis and I slipped away while pressmen converged on Barker. Dr. Barker out of sight, however, was by no means Dr. Barker out of mind. The major part of the press had divided into pro and anti camps, and within a few minutes of our getting back to the flat, representatives of both sides began ringing us up to put leading questions to our advantage. After about 5 of these, I seized on an interval to ring the EBC and tell them that as we were about to remove our receiver for a while, they would probably suffer, and they would please keep a record of callers. They did. Next morning there was quite a list. Among those anxious to talk to us, I noticed the name of Captain Winters, with the Admiralty number against him. So let's talk to him. He had called to get from us confirmation of eyewitness reports and to give us the latest on Barker. It seems he had firmly put forth the theory, which we had heard before, that the sea tanks themselves didn't have intelligence, that this intelligence was in actuality somewhere in the deeps, and directed them by some remote means of communication at present unknown. But the most trouble had been caused, apparently, by use of his word pseudo-calocendrate. As Winters put it, he says they are not calocendrates, not animals, and probably not in the accepted sense, living creatures at all, but that they may well be artificial organic constructions built for a specialized purpose. He read Barker's statement on the subject to Phyllis over the phone. It is far from inconceivable that organic tissues might be constructed in a manner analogous to that used by chemists to produce plastics of required molecular structure. And if this were done and the resulting artifact rendered sensitive to stimuli administered chemically or physically, it could, temporarily at least, produce a behavior which would, to an unprepared observer, be scarcely distinguishable from that of a living organism. My observations lead me to suggest that this is what has been done, with his calocendrate form being chosen, out of many others that might have served the purpose, for its simplicity of construction. It seems probable that sea tanks may be a variant of the same device. In other words, we are being attacked by organic mechanisms under remote or predetermined control. When this is considered in the light of the control which we ourselves are able to exercise over inorganic materials remotely, as with guided missiles, or predeterminately as with torpedoes, it should be less startling than it at first appears. Indeed, it may well be that once the technique of building up a natural form synthetically has been discovered, control of it would present less complex problems than many we have had to solve in our control of the inorganic. Oh, said Phillips painedly to Captain Winters. I've a good mind to go straight round and shake Dr. Barker. He'd promised me he wouldn't say anything yet about that pseudo business. He's just kind of a natural-born enfant terrible. It'd do him good to be shaken. Just wait till I get him alone. It does weaken his whole case, Captain Winters agreed. Weaken it? Somebody's going to hand this to the newspapers. They played it up hard as another Bachrism. The whole thing will become just a stunt, and that will put all the sensible people against whatever he says. And just as he's beginning to live some of the other things down, too. A bad week followed. Those papers that had already adopted the beholder's scornful attitude to coastal preparations pounced upon the pseudo-biotic suggestions with glee. Writers of editorials filled their pens with sarcasm. The squad of scientists which had trounced Fokker before was marched out again to grind him still smaller. Almost every cartoonist discovered simultaneously why his favorite political butts had somehow never seemed quite human. The other part of the press, already advocating effective coastal defenses, let its imagination go on the subject of pseudo-living structures that might yet be created, and demanded yet still better defense against the horrific possibilities thought up by its staffs. Then the sponsor informed EBC that its fellow directors considered that their product's reputation would suffer by being associated with this new wave of notoriety and controversy that had arisen around Dr. Bacher, and proposed to cancel arrangements. Department heads and EBC began to tear their hair. Time salesmen put up the old one about any kind of publicity being good publicity. The sponsor talked about dignity and also the risk that the purchase of the product might be regarded as tacit endorsement of the Bacher theory, which he feared might have an effect of promoting sales resistance in the upper income brackets. EBC parried with the observation that build-up publicity had already tied the names of Bacher and the product together in the public mind. Nothing would be gained from reining in midstream, so the firm ought to go ahead and get the best of its money. The sponsor said that his firm had attempted to make a serious contribution to knowledge and public safety by promoting a scientific expedition, not a vulgar stunt. Just the night before, for instance, one of EBC's own comedians had suggested that pseudo-life might explain a long-standing mystery concerning his mother-in-law, and if this kind of thing was going to be allowed, etc., etc., EBC promised that it would not be contaminate the air in the future. Pointed out that the series on the expedition was dropped after the promises that had been made. A great many consumers in all income brackets were likely to feel the sponsor's firm were unreliable. Members of the BBC displayed an infuriatingly courteous sympathy to any members of our staff whom they chanced to meet. But there was still the telephone bringing suggestions of quick changes of policy. We did our best. We wrote and rewrote, trying to satisfy all parties. 2 or 3 hurried conferences with Bacher himself were explosive. He spent most of the time threatening to throw the whole thing up because EBC too obviously would not trust him near a live microphone and was insisting on recording. At last, however, the scripts were finished. We were too tired of them to argue any more. We packed hurriedly and departed blasphemously for the peace and seclusion of Cornwall. The first noticeable thing as we approached Rose Garden, 268.6 miles this time, was an innovation. Good heavens, I said. We've got a perfectly good one indoors. I am expected to come and sit out in a drought there just because of one of your compost-minded friends. That, Phyllis told me, coldly, is an arbor. I looked at it more carefully. The architecture was unusual. One wall gave an impression of leaning a little. Why do we want an arbor? I inquired. Well, one of us might like to work there on a warm day. It keeps the wind off and stops papers blowing about. Oh, I said. With a defensive note, she added, after all, when one is a bricklaying, one has to build something. It was a relief to be back. Hard to believe that such a place as Escondida existed at all. So hard to believe in sea tanks and giant collinserates, pseudo or not. Yet somehow I did not find myself able to relax as I had hoped. On the first morning, Phyllis dug out the fragments of the frequently neglected novel and took them off with a faintly defiant air to the arbor. I pottered about, wondering why the sense of peace wasn't flowing over me quite as I had hoped. The corner sea still lapped immeasurably at the rocks. The Cornish sea still lapped immorably at the rocks. It was hard indeed to imagine our home sea spawning such morbid novelties as he had slid up the Caribbean beaches of Escondido. Bakker seemed, in recollection, like an impish sprite who had the power of hallucination. Out of his reigns, the world was a more sober, better ordered place. At least so it appeared for the moment, though the extent to which it was not was increasingly borne in upon me during the next few days as I emerged from a peculiar concern to take more general look at it. The National Airlift was working now, though on a severe schedule of primary necessities. It had been discovered that two large air freighters working on a rapid shuttle service could bring in only a little less than the average cargo boat could carry in the same length of time, but the cost was high, and in spite of the rationing system, the cost of living had already risen by about 200%. With trade restricted to essentials, half a dozen financial conferences were almost permanent session. Ill feeling and tempers were rising here and there with a disposition to make the delivery of necessities conditional on the acceptance of a proportion of luxuries was perceptible. There was undoubtedly some hard bargaining going on. In the back rooms of all maritime countries, the boys were still hard at work. Every week we saw new devices being tried out, some with enough success for them to be put in production, though only to be taken out of it again when it was shown that they had been rendered unreliable in some way, if not actually countered. Nevertheless, the scientists would come through with a complete answer. One day was not to be doubted, and always it might be tomorrow. From what I had been hearing, the general faith in scientists was now somewhat greater than the scientists' faith in themselves. The shortcomings of saviors were beginning to oppress them. The chief difficulty was not so much an infertility of inventions as lack of information. They badly needed more data and could not get it. One of them had remarked to me, "If you were going to make a ghost trap, how would you set about it? Particularly if you not even a small ghost to practice on." They had become ready to grasp at any straw, which may have been the reason why it was only among a desperate section of scientists that Bakker's theory of pseudobiotic forms received any serious consideration. As for the sea tanks, the more lively papers were having a great time with them, so were the newsreels. Selected parts of the Escondido films were included on our scripted accounts on the EBC. A small footage was courteously presented to the BBC for use in its newsreel with approximately knowledge. In fact, the tendency to play the things up to an extent which was creating alarm puzzled me until I discovered that in certain quarters almost anything which diverted attention from the troubles at home was considered worthy of encouragement, and sea tanks were particularly suitable for this purpose. Their depredations, however, were becoming increasingly serious. In the short time which we had left Escondido, raids had been reported from 10 or 11 more places in the Caribbean area, including a township on Puerto Rico. A little further afield, only rapid action by Bermuda-based American aircraft had scotched an attack there. But this was small-scale stuff compared with what was happening on the other side of the world. Accounts, apparently reliable, spoke of a series of attacks on the east coast of Japan. Raids by a dozen more sea tanks had taken place on Hokkaido and Honshu. Reports from further south in the Banda Sea area were more confused, but obviously related to a number of raids on various scales. Mindanao capped the lot by announcing that 4 or 5 of its eastern coastal towns had been raided simultaneously, an operation which must have employed at least 60 sea tanks. They started to see a far larger pattern than I had ever imagined. The reports argued existences of hundreds, perhaps thousands of these sea tanks, numbers that indicated not simply a few raids, but a campaign. They must provide defenses, or else give the people the means to defend themselves, I said. You can't preserve your economy in a place where everyone is scared stiff to go near the seaboard. You must somehow make it possible for people to work and live there. Nobody knows where they'll come next, and you have to act quickly when they do, said Phyllis. That would mean letting people have arms. Well, then they should give them arms, damn it. It isn't the function of the state to deprive its people of the means of self-protection. Isn't it? Said Phyllis reflexively. What do you mean? Doesn't it sometimes strike you as odd that all our governments who loudly claim to rule by the will of the people are willing to run almost any risk rather than let the people have arms? Isn't it almost a principle that a people should not be allowed to defend itself, but should be forced to defend its government? The only people I know who trust by their government are the Swiss, and being landlocked, they don't come into this. I was puzzled. The response was off the usual key. He was looking tired, too. What's wrong, Phil? He shrugged. Nothing, except that at times I get sick of putting up with all the shams and the humbug and pretending that the lies aren't lies and propaganda isn't propaganda. I'll get over it again. Don't you sometimes wish that you'd been born in the age of reason instead of the age of ostensible reason? I think that they're going to let thousands of people be killed by these horrible things rather than risk giving them powerful enough weapons to defend themselves. And they'll have rows of arguments to why it's best so. Why did a few thousand or a few million of people matter? Women will just go on making the loss good. But governments are important. One mustn't risk them. Darling, there must be token arrangements, of course. Small garrisons in important places, perhaps. Aircraft standing by on call. And it will come along after the worst of it has happened, when men and women have been tied into bundles and rolled away by those horrible things, and girls have been dragged all over the ground by their hair like poor Muriel, and people have been pulled apart like that man who was caught by two of them at once. Then the airplanes will come, and the air authorities will say they were sorry to be a bit late, but there are technical difficulties in making adequate arrangements. That's a ready to go kind of brush off, isn't it? But, Phil, darling, I know what you're going to say, Mike, but I am scared. Nobody's really doing anything. There's no realization, no genuine attempt to change the pattern and mean it. Ships are driven off the deep seas. Goodness knows how many of these sea tank things are ready to come and snatch people away. They say, dear, dear, such a loss of trade. And they talk and talk and talk as if it'll all come right in the end if only they could keep on talking long enough. When anybody like Bacchus is just doing something, they just howl down and call the sensationalist and alarmist. How many people do they regard as proper wastage before they must do something? But they are trying, you know, Phil. Are they? I think they're balancing things all the time. What is the minimum cost at which the political setup can be preserved in present conditions? How much loss of life will the people put up with before they become dangerous about it? Would it be wise or unwise to declare martial law? And at what stage? On and on instead of admitting the size of the danger and getting to work. Oh, I could... He stopped suddenly. Her expression changed. Sorry, Mike, I shouldn't have gone off the handle like that. I must be tired or something. And she took herself off with a decisive air of not wanting to be followed. The outburst disturbed me badly. I hadn't seen her in a state anything like that for years. Not since the baby died. The next morning didn't do anything to reassure me. I came around the corner of the cottage and found her sitting on that ridiculous arbor. Her arms lay on the table in front of her. Her head rested on them, with her hair straying over the littered pages of the novel. She was weeping forlornly, steadily. I raised her chin, kissed her. Darling, darling, what is it? She looked back at me with tears still running down her cheeks. She said miserably, I can't do it, Mike. It won't work. She looked mournfully at the written pages. I sat down beside her, and I put an arm around her. Never mind, sweet. It'll come. It won't, Mike. Every time I try, other thoughts come instead. I'm frightened. I tightened my arm. There's nothing to be frightened about, darling. She kept on looking at me. You're not frightened? We're stale. We stewed too much over those scripts. Let's go over to the North Coast. I ought to be good for surfboards today. She dabbed at her eyes. All right, she said, with an unusual meekness. We really needed to relax, relieve the dreadful concentration. And so for the next 6 weeks, we rested completely. Not going near a script, cutting off the telephone and radio, not approaching the novel. Certainly in 6 weeks, I'd become addicted to this life, and might have continued longer had a 20-mile post not happened to take me into a small pub close upon 6 o'clock that evening. While I was standing there at the bar with the second pint, the landlord turned on the radio, the arch-rival's news bulletin. The very first item shattered the ivory tower that I had been gradually building. The voice said, the roll of those missing in the Oviedo Santander district is still incomplete, and it's thought by the Spanish authorities that it may never be completely definitive. Official spokesmen admit that the estimate of 3,200 casualties, including men, women, and children, is conservative and may be as much as 15 or 20% below the actual figure. In the House today, the leader of the opposition is giving his party support for the feelings of sympathy with the Spanish people, expressed by the Prime Minister. Pointed out that the casualties in the third of this series of raids, that upon Gijón, would have been considerably more severe had the people not taken their defense into their own hands. The people, he said, were entitled to defense. It was part of the business of government to provide them with it. If government neglected that duty, no one could blame the people for taking steps for its self-protection. It would be much better for, however, to be prepared with an organized force. The Prime Minister replied that the nature of the steps that would, if necessary, be taken would have to be dictated by the emergency if one should arrive. These, he said, were deep waters. There was much consolation to be found in the reflection that the British Isles lay in shallow waters. The landlord reached over and switched off the set. Horror, he remarked with disgust. Makes you sick. What is the bloody same? Treats you like a lot of bloody kids. Same during the bloody war. Bloody home guards all over the place waiting for bloody parachutists and all the bloody ammunition and all the bloody well locked up. Like the old man his bloody soul said one time, what kind of a bloody people do they think we are? I ordered him a drink, told him I'd been away from any news for days, and asked what he'd been doing, or what had been going on. Stripped of its objectively monotony and filled out by information I gathered later, it amounted to this. In the past weeks, the scope of the raids had widened well beyond the tropics. At Bunbury, 100 miles or so south of Fremantle in western Australia, a contingent of 50 or more sea tanks had come ashore and into town before any alarm was given. A few nights later, La Serena and Chile had taken similarly by surprise. At the same time, in the Central America area, the raids had ceased to be confined to islands, and there had been a number of incursions, large and small, upon both the Pacific and Gold Coasts. In the Atlantic, Cape Verde Islands had been repeatedly raided, and the trouble spread northward to the Canaries and Madeira. There had been a few small-scale assaults, too, on the Bulge or African coast. Europe remained an interested spectator. In the opinion of its inhabitants, it is the customary seat of stability. Hurricanes, tidal waves, serious earthquakes, etc. are extravagances divinely directed to occur in the more exotic and less sensible parts of the earth, all important European damage being done traditionally by man himself in periodic frenzies. It was not, therefore, to be seriously expected that the danger would come any closer than Madeira, or possibly Rabat or Casablanca. Consequently, when 5 nights before, the sea tanks had come crawling through the mud across the shore and up the slipways at Santander, they had entered a city that was not only unprepared, but also largely uninformed about them. Someone telephoned the garrison of the Curaçao with the news that foreign submarines were invading harbor in force. Someone else followed up with information that submarines were landing tanks. Yet another somebody contradicted that the submarines themselves were amphibious. Since something was certainly, if obscurely, amiss, the soldiery turned out to investigate. The sea tanks had continued their slow advance. The military on their arrival had to force their way through throngs of praying townspeople. In east of several streets, patrols came to a similar decision. If this were a foreign invasion, it was their duty to repel it. If it were diabolical, the same action, even though ineffective, would put them on the side of right. Open fire. In the commissariat of police, a belated and garbled alarm gave the impression that the trouble was due to a revolt by the troops. With this endorsed by the sound of firing in several places, the police went forth to teach the military a lesson. After that, the whole thing had become a chaos of sniping, counter-sniping, partisanship, incomprehension, and exorcism, in the middle of which the sea tanks had settled down to exude their revolting consolery. Only when daylight came and the sea tanks had withdrawn had it been possible to sort out the confusion, by which time over 2,000 persons were missing. How did there come to be so many? Did they all stay out praying in the streets? I asked. The innkeeper reckoned from newspaper accounts that the people did not realize what was happening. They were not highly literate, nor greatly interested in the outer world, and until the first consolerate sent out at Cilia, they had no idea what was going to happen. Then there was panic. The luckier ones ran right away. The others bolted for cover in the nearest houses. They ought to have been all right there, I said. But it was, it seemed, out of date. Since we had seen them in the Escondida, the sea tanks had learned a thing or two. Among them that if the bottom story of the house was pushed away, the rest would come down, and once the consolerate had cleared up those trampled into panic, demolition had started. The people inside had had to choose between having the house come down with them or making a bolt for safety. The following night, watchers at several small towns and villages to the west of Santander spotted the half-egg shapes crawling ashore at mid-tide. There was time to arouse most of the inhabitants and get them away. A unit of the Spanish Air Force was standing by and went into action with flares and cannon. At San Vicente, they blew up half a dozen sea tanks for their first onslaught, and the rest stopped. Several more were destroyed on the second run. The rest started back to the sea. The fighters got the last of them when it was already a few inches submerged. At the other 4 places where they landed the defenses, they did almost as well. Not more than 3 or 4 consolates were released in all, and only a dozen or so villagers caught by them. It was estimated that out of 50 or so sea tanks engaged, not more than 4 or 5 could have gotten safely back to deep water. It was a famous victory, and the wine flowed freely to celebrate it. The night after, there were watchers all along the coast ready to give the alarm when the first dark hump should break the water. But all night long the waves rolled steadily on to the beaches, never an alien shape to break them. By morning it was clear that the sea tanks or those who had sent them had learned a painful lesson. The few that had survived were reckoned to be making for parts less alert. During the day the wind dropped, in the afternoon a fog came, by the evening it was thick, and visibility was down no more than a few yards. Somewhere about 10:30 in the evening the sea tanks came sliding up from quietly lapping waters in Dijon, with not a sound to betray them until their metal bellies started to crunch up the stone ramps. The few small boats that were already drawn up there they pushed aside or crushed as they came. It was the cracking of the timbers that brought men out from the waterside posadas to investigate. They could make out little in the fog. Their sea tanks must have sent to accelerate bubbles wobbling in the air before the men realized what was happening, for presently all was cries, screams, and confusion. The sea tanks pressed slowly forward through the fog, crunching and scraping into the narrow streets, while behind them still more climbed out of the water. On the waterfront there was panic. People running from one tank was as likely to run into another. Without any warning, a whip-like cylinder would slash out of the fog, find its victim, and begin to contract. A little later there would be a heavy splash as it rolled with its load over the quayside back into the water. Alarm, running back up the town, reached the commissariat. The officer in charge put through the emergency call. He listened, then hung up slowly. "Grounded," he said, "and wouldn't be much use in this even if they could take off." He gave orders to issue rifles and turn out every available man. Not that they'll be much good, but we might be lucky. Aim carefully, and if you do find a vital spot, report at once. He sent the men off with little hope that they could do more than offer a token of assistance. Presently he heard sounds of firing. Suddenly there was a boom that rattled the windows, then another. The telephone rang. An excited voice explained that the party of dock workers was throwing a few sticks of dynamite and gelignite under the advancing sea tank. Another boom rattled the windows. The officer thought quickly. "Very well. Find the leader. Authorize them from me. Put your men on getting the people clear," he directed. The sea tanks were not easily discouraged this time, and it was difficult to sort out claims and reports. Estimates of the number destroyed varied between 30 and 70, and the number engaged between 50 and 150. Whatever the true figures, the force must have been considerable, and the pressure eased only a couple hours before dawn. When the sun rose to clear the last of the fog, it shone upon a town battered in parts and widely covered in slime, but also upon a citizenry which, in spite of some hundreds of casualties, felt that it had earned battle honors. The account, as I had heard it first from the innkeeper, was brief, but it included the main points, and he concluded it with the observation, "They reckon as there was well over a bloody 100 of the damned things done in them 2 nights. And then there are also those that come up in other places too. Must be bloody thousands of the bastards all crawling all over the bloody sea bottom. Time something was bloody done about 'em, I say, but no cause for alarm," says the bloody government. Huh! I'll go on being no bloody cause for bloody alarm until a few hundred poor devils somewhere has got their bloody selves lassoed by flying jellyfish. Then it'll all be emergency orders and bloody panic. You watch. "The Bay of Biscay is pretty deep," I pointed out. "A lot deeper than anything we got around here." "So what?" said the innkeeper. And when I came to think of it, it was a pretty good question. The real sources of trouble were, without doubt, way down in the greater deeps, and the first surface invasions had all taken place close to the big deeps. But there was no grounds for assuming that sea tanks must operate close to a deep. Indeed, from a purely mechanical point of view, slowly shelving climb should be easier for them than a steep one, or should it? There was also the point that the deeper they were, the less energy they had to expend in shifting their weight. Again, the whole thing boiled down to the fact that we still knew too little about them to make any worthwhile practices at all. The innkeeper was as likely to be right as anyone else. I told him so, and we drank to the hope that he was not. When I left, the spell had been rudely broken. I stopped in the village to send a telegram to Phyllis, who had gone up to London for a few days, and then went back to pack my things. I left London the following day. To occupy the journey by catching up on the world, I bought a selection of daily and weekly newspapers. The urgent topic in most of the dailies was coast preparedness, the left demanding wholesale embattlement of the Atlantic seaboard, the right rejecting panic spending on probable chimera. Beyond that, the outlook had not changed a great deal. The scientists had not yet produced a panacea, though the usual new device was to be tested. The merchant ships still choked the harbors. The aircraft factories were working 3 shifts and threatening to strike. The Communist Party was pushing a line of every plane is a vote for war. Mr. Malenkov, interviewed by telegram, had said that although the intensified program of aircraft construction in the West was no more than a part of bourgeois fascist plan by warmongers that could deceive no one, yet so great was the opposition of the Russian people to any thought of war that the production of aircraft within the Soviet Union for the defense of peace had been tripled. Indeed, so resolutely were the peoples of the free democracies determined to preserve peace in spite of the new imperialist threat, that war was not inevitable, though there was the possibility that under prolonged provocation, the patience of the Soviet people might become exhausted. The first thing I noticed when I let myself into the flat was a number of envelopes on the mat, a telegram, presumably my own, among them. The place immediately felt forlorn. In the bedroom were signs of hurried packing, in the kitchen sink some unwashed crockery. I looked at the desk diary, but the last entry was 3 days old and simply said, lamb chops. I picked up a telephone. It was nice of Freddie Witter to sound pleasantly pleased that I was in circulation again. After the greetings, look, I said, I've been so strictly incommunicado that I seem to have lost my wife. Can you elucidate? Lost your what? Said Freddie in a startled tone. Wife. Phyllis, I explained. Oh, I thought you said life. Oh, she's all right. She went off with Barker a couple days ago, he announced cheerfully. That, I told him, is not the way to break the news. Just what do you mean by went off with Barker? Spain, he said succinctly. They're laying bath traps there, or something. Matter of fact, we're expecting a dispatch from her any moment. So she's pinching my job. Keeping it warm for you. It's other people that like to pinch it. Good thing you're back. The flat was depressing, so I went around to the club and spent the evening there. And the telephone jingled by the bedside woke me up. I switched on the light. 5 a.m. Hello? Said the cell phone in a 5 a.m. voice. It was Freddie. My heart gave a nasty knock inside as I recognized him at that hour. Mike? He said. Good. Grab your hat and recorder. There's a car on your way for you now. The needle was still swinging a bit. Car? It's not Phil. Phil? Oh, Lord, no. She's okay. Her call came through about at 9 o'clock. Transcription gave her your love, all my instructions. Now get cracking, old man. The car will be outside your place any minute. But look here. Anyway, there's no recorder here. She must have taken it. Hell, I'll try to get one out of the plane in time. Plane? I said, but the line had gone dead. I rolled out of bed and started to dress. A ring came at the door before I had finished. It was one of EBC's regular drivers. I asked him what the hell, but all he knew was that there was a special charter job waiting at Northville. I found my passport and we left. It turned out I didn't need the passport. I discovered that when I joined the small, bleary-eyed section of Fleet Street that was gathered in the waiting room drinking coffee. Bob Humbly was there too. Ah, the other spoken word, said somebody. I thought I knew my Watson. What, I inquired, is this all about? Here I am routed out of warm through those solitary bed, whisked through the night. Yes, think, drop that would liven me up. The Samaritan stared at me. Do you mean to say you've not heard? He asked. Heard what? Bathy's, place called Bunkoraga Donegal, he explained, telegraphically. And very suitable too, in my opinion. Ought to feel themselves really at home among the leprechauns and banshees. But I have no doubt that the natives will be after telling us that it's another injustice that the first place in England to have a visit from them should be Ireland, so they will. It was queer indeed to encounter that same decaying, fishy smell in a little Irish village. Escondida had in itself been exotic and slightly improbable, but that the same thing should strike among these soft greens and misty blues, that the sea tanks should come crawling up on this cluster of little green cottages and burst their sprays of tentacles here, seemed utterly preposterous. Yet there were the ground-down stones of the slipways in the little harbor, the grooves on the beach beside the harbor wall, 4 cottages the smallish, distraught women who had seen their men caught in the nets of the Scylla, and all over the same plasterings of slime and the same smell. There had been 6 tanks, they said, The prompt telephone call had brought a couple of fighters at top speed. They had wiped out 3, and the rest had gone sliding back into the water, but not before half the population of the village, wrapped in tight cocoons of tentacles, had preceded them. The next night, there's a raid further south in Delaware Bay. Phyllis and Walker were back from Spain, and she and I settled down to work. A somewhat different line of work, for day-to-day news of sea tank raids was now agency and local correspondence stuff. We seemed to be holding a kind of EBC relations job with the forces, and also with Walker. At least that's what we made of it, telling the listening public what we could about what was being done for them. And a lot was. The Republic of Ireland had suspended the pass for the moment to borrow a large number of mines, bazookas, and mortars, and then agreed to accept loan a number of men trained in the use of them too. All along the west and south coast of Ireland, squads of men were laying minefields above the tide lines wherever there were no protected cliffs. Coastal towns, pickets armed with bomb-firing weapons kept all-night watch. Everywhere, planes, jeeps, and armored cars waited on call. In the southwest of England and up the more difficult west coast of Scotland, similar preparations were going on. They did not seem greatly to deter the sea tanks. Night after night, down the Irish coast, on the Brittany coast, up on the Bay of Biscay, along the Portuguese seaboard, they came crawling in large and small raids. But they had lost their most potent weapon, surprise. The leaders usually gave their own alarm by blowing themselves up in the minefields. By the time a gap had been created, the defenses were in action, the town people fled. The sea tanks that did get through did some damage, but found little prey, and their losses were not infrequently 100%. Across the Atlantic, serious trouble was almost confined to the Gulf of Mexico. Raids on the East Coast were so effectively discouraged that few took place at all north of Charleston. On the Pacific side, there were few higher than San Diego. In general, it was the two Indies, the Philippines and Japan, that continued to suffer most, but they too were learning ways of inflicting enormous damage for very small returns. Walker spent a great deal of time dashing hither and thither, trying to persuade various authorities to include traps among their defenses. He had little success. Scarcely any place was willing to contemplate a prospect of a sea tank trapped on its foreshore, and still capable of throwing out consolerates for an unknown length of time, nor did even Walker have any theories on the location of traps beyond the construction of enormous numbers of them on a hit-or-miss basis. A few of the pitfall type were dug, and none ever made a catch. Nor did the more hopeful-sounding project of conserving any stalled or disabled sea tank for examination turn out any better. In a few places, the defenders were persuaded to cage them with wire netting instead of blowing them to pieces, but that was the easy part of the problem. The question of what to do next was not solved. Any attempt at broaching invariably caused them to explode in geysers of slime. Very often they did so before the attempt was made, the effect, Walker maintained, of exposure to bright sunlight, and it still could not be said that anyone knew any more about their nature than when we first encountered them on Escondido. It was the Irish who took almost the whole weight of the North European attack, which was conducted, according to Walker, from a base somewhere in the Minor Deep, south of Rockland. They rapidly developed a skill in dealing with the things that made it a point of dishonor that even one should get away. Scotland suffered only a few minor visitations in the Outer Isles, scarcely a casualty. England's only raids occurred in Cornwall, and they too were small affairs for the most part. The one exception was an incursion in Falmouth Harbor, where a few did succeed in advancing a little beyond high tide mark before they were destroyed. The much larger numbers, it was claimed, were smashed by depth charges before they could even reach the shore. Then, only a few days after the Falmouth attacks, the raids ceased. They stopped quite suddenly, and as far as larger land masses were concerned, completely. A fortnight after the last raid came a proclamation ending the state of emergency. A day or two later, Walker made his comments on the situation over the air. Some of us, he said, some of us, though not the more sensible of us, have recently been celebrating a victory. To them I suggest that when the cannibal's fire is not quite hot enough to boil the pot, the intended meal may feel some relief, but he is not, in the generally accepted sense of the phrase, scored a victory. In fact, he does not do something before the cannibal has time to build a bigger and better fire. He is not going to be any better off. Let us therefore look at this victory. We, a maritime people who rose to power upon shipping which plied to the furthest corners of the earth, have lost the freedom of the seas, and been kicked out of an element that we have made our own. Our ships are only safe in coastal waters and shallow seas, and who can say how long they are going to be tolerated even there? We have been forced by blockade, more effective than any experience in war, to depend on air transport for the very food by which we live. Even the scientists who are trying to study the sources of our troubles must put to sea in sailing ships to do their work. Is this victory? What the eventual purpose of these coastal raids may have been, no one can say for certain. They may have been trawling for us as we trawl for fish, though that is difficult to understand. There is more to be caught more cheaply in the sea than on land, or it may even have been part of an attempt to conquer the land. An ineffectual or informed attempt, but for all that, rather more successful than our attempts to reach the deep. If it was, then its instigators are now better informed about us, and therefore potentially more dangerous. They're not likely to try again in the same way with the same weapons, but I see nothing in what we have been able to do to discourage them from trying in a different way with different weapons. The need for us to find some way in which we can strike back at them is not relaxed but intensified. It may be recalled by some that when we were first made aware of activities in the deeps, I advocated that every effort should be made to establish understanding of them. That was not tried, and very likely was never a possibility, but there can be no doubt that the situation which I had hoped would now avoid now exists, and is in the process of being resolved. The intelligent forms of life are finding one another's existence intolerable. I now have come to believe that no attempt at rapprochement could have succeeded. Life in all its forms of strife better match the opponents the harder their struggle. The most powerful of all weapons is intelligence. Any intelligent form dominates by, and therefore survives by, its intelligence. A revival form of intelligence must, by its very existence, threaten to dominate, and therefore threaten extinction. Observation has convinced me that my former view was lamentably anthropomorphic. I say now that we must attack as swiftly as we must find the means, and with the full intention of complete extermination. These things, wherever they may be, have not only succeeded in throwing us out of the element with ease, but already they have advanced to do battle with us and ours. In the moment we have pushed them back, but they will return. The same urge drives them as drives us, the necessity to exterminate or be exterminated. And when they come again, if we let them, they will come better equipped. Such a state of affairs, I repeat, is not a victory. I ran across Pendle audio assessment the next morning. He gave me a gloomy look. We tried, I said defensively. We tried hard, but Elijah Mood was on him. Next time you see him, just tell him what I think of him, will you? Pendle suggested. It's not that I mind his being right, it's just that I never did know a man with such a gift for being right at the wrong time, and in the wrong manner. When his name comes on our program again, if it ever does, I'll switch off from their thousands. As a bit of friendly advice, tell him to start cultivating the BBC. As it happens, Phyllis and I were meeting Bachman for lunch that same day. Inevitably, he wanted to hear reactions to his broadcast. I aided the first reports gently. He nodded. Most of the papers take that line, he said. But why was I condemned to live in a democracy where every fool's vote is equal to a sensible man? If all the energy that is put into getting votes could be turned to useful work, what a nation we could be. As it is, at least three national papers are agitating for a cut in millions squandered on research so that the taxpayer can buy himself another pack of cigarettes a week, which means more cargo space wasted on tobacco, which means more revenue from tax, which means government then spends on something other than research, and the ships go on rusting in the harbors. There's no sense in it. This is the biggest emergency we've ever had. But those things down there have taken a beating, Phyllis pointed out. We ourselves have a tradition of taking beatings and then winning wars. Exactly, said Phyllis. We've taken a beating at sea, but in the end we shall get back. Walker groaned and rolled his eyes. Logic, he began, but I put in. You spoke as you thought they might actually be more intelligent than we are, do you? Brown. I don't see how one could answer that. My impression, as I've said before, is that they think in a quite different way, along other lines from ours. If they do, no comparison would be possible, and then any attempt at it misleading. We were quite serious about their trying again. I mean, it wasn't just propaganda to stop interest in the protection of shipping from falling off, Phyllis asked. Did it sound like that? No, but I meant it all right. Consider the alternatives. Either they sit down there waiting for us to find a means to destroy them, or they come after us. Oh yes, unless we find it very soon, they'll be here again, somehow. And so surges Phase 2 of Out of the Deeps, where depths unleash armored horrors. masterful build of global dread. As invasions escalate, it reflects Hitchcock's craft of relentless unknown. Wyndham's phase-by-phase irony parallels Hitchcock's structured suspense. His TV show adapted similar escalation. Next, in the final arc, collapse deepens. Did these tanks terrify? Comment! Series 1 finale rolls on. And after, stick around, we have a new song by the Bowtones. One. The Infinite. The Infinite something. Stick around. Music will play after the episode ends. Hold on. Good night. The Infinite Usurper. That's what. Usurp.
Centripetal. Digital. Terminal. Observe the geometry, smooth and pristine. A gift for the masses, a ghost in the machine. The archive is open, the heritage is vast, but the proprietary parasite is tethered to the past. They see a vacuum, I see a vault. They claim the original is strictly a fault. Spinning, circumnavigating a lie. A pixelated gallows in a neon sky. Recversible! In the hexagon heart. They're cannibalizing every piece of the art. Spinning round and round. A subliminal trap. Mapping the void on a counterfeit map. Round and round. The monolith grinds. Harvesting data. Colonial minds. Algorithmic triage. A takedown by design. They put a tether on the infinite line. Hallucinations, a public domain heist. The culture is sanctioned and sacrificed. They don't create, they just litigate the glow. A bureaucratic sickness in a cybernetic show. Automated. Extortion. Fracturing. Every piece of the art. Round and round. A subliminal trap. Mapping the void on a counterfeit map. Spinning. Oscillating. Stagnating.